I have a technical question. Oh, sorry. Hi, John.
Hey, Carol.
I have a technical question that the screen we are seeing right now will be changed to the regular one, right?
When you speak, Ambassador Hsiao's face will appear, and she'll be the only one on the screen when she's talking.
Okay, great. Because we need to put her
Yes.
transcript on the other side, so we need to take the monitor, the control of the monitor back.
I don't
We
exactly.
need to, no, I mean, we need to go back to the previous showing.
Oh, the way it looked before.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
this slide is going to go away when we start.
Okay, that'll be great. Thank you.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Greetings, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world right now. I am Howie Lin, the president of the International Stability Operations Association, or ISOA. Welcome to this joint event on Taiwan with the Project 2049 Institute, led by John Gastwright. You'll hear from John in just a minute. Thank you for joining this virtual conference today entitled Taiwan's Global Gravity, the Push and Pull of Coercive and Annihilative Cross-Strait Scenarios. This may sound a little provocative because it is provocative due to the very serious consequences of China's possible aggression here. This forum will feature a keynote opening address from the Honorable Bi-khim Hsiao, who is Taiwan's representative to the United States. And we'll have a closing discussion with Project 2049 Chairman Randall Schriver and Congresswoman Elaine Luria from the 2nd District of Virginia. In between, we'll host a panel to discuss Taiwan's defense and operational readiness, followed by another group of experts to discuss the United Nations and Taiwan's international space. You'll be able to ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. Let me tell you a little bit about ISOA. We're a private sector-based organization made up of over 120 companies of all sizes, consisting of many different industries. These businesses support the US government and our allies around the world, primarily in the defense, diplomatic, development, and intelligence communities. We exist to support your company's growth and success in the government contracting marketplace. We hold events such as this virtual forum, as well as large in-person events overseas and in the Washington, D.C. area throughout the year. Just a few weeks ago, we held our in-person Middle East conference in Dubai. And last October, we held our in-person annual summit in Arlington, Virginia. We're planning to hold a conference in Stuttgart, Germany this April that will focus on EUCOM and AFRICOM. We have a lot to offer you as a member of ISOA. Please visit our website at stability-operations.org to learn more about us. For all of our conferences and meetings, our standard practice is that we use the Chatham House rules, which means that all of the discussion and presentations are to be off the record, and that attribution to a specific speaker is not allowed without their express permission. Also, we are nonpartisan, so please refrain from political commentary. I'll now introduce John Gastwright for his opening remarks. John serves as the president of the Project 2049 Institute and wears many other hats too. John is the vice chairman of the ISOA Board of Directors, and in his day job, he is senior vice president for Amentum. John served as an officer in the US Navy. He also served as an official in the US Department of State. And he is a proud graduate of the Citadel, where he played on their football team. With that, welcome John Gastwright.
Thank you, Howie. I really appreciate that. And I am super excited about today's event and so pleased that we've been able to bring these two great organizations together. As Howie said, my name is John Gastwright, and as he mentioned, I'm not only the vice chairman of the board at ISOA, but also the president of the Project 2049 Institute. So thank you for that. Project 2049 is a nonpartisan think tank focused on a free and open Indo-Pacific. And today's forum is designed to expand our thinking with regard to that, what it will take to have a free and open Indo-Pacific, and in particular on Taiwan's role in that regard. I won't repeat everything Howie said about what we're going to do and what we're going to talk about, but I do have a bit of administrivia that I need to go over so that you can have the best viewing experience. First, there are 2 ways to participate in today's Q&A sessions, which will follow panel 1, panel 2, and the discussion with Secretary Schriver and Congresswoman Luria. Number 1, if you're registered for the event and watching on Zoom, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. And if you have a YouTube account and you're following this on Project 2049's YouTube channel, you could submit questions in the YouTube chat box and our team will collect and send them to the moderator. Now, please be sure to include your name and affiliation when submitting questions. The questions with names and affiliations get top priority. Now, let's get things started. I have the great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Bi-khim Hsiao, Taiwan's representative to the United States. Ambassador Hsiao took up her post in Washington in July 2020 after serving as a senior advisor to President Tsai at the National Security Council of Taiwan. She previously served 4 terms in the Taiwan legislature, where for many years, she was the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. She's a democracy advocate with a long history of support for democracy non-governmental organizations, not to mention her long-standing role with Taiwan's Democratic Progressive Party. She has a master's degree from Columbia University in New York and did her undergraduate work at Oberlin College. And I'm informed if you really want to get her energized, ask her to talk about diplomacy and the cat warrior. With that, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Bi-khim Hsiao. Ambassador?
Good afternoon, and thanks for that kind introduction. I'm afraid my remarks might not be as long as your introduction, but it's a great honor to join you today, especially in the beginning of this very timely discussion. And I do also want to thank the Project 2049 Institute, not only for organizing this event today, but also for the work that you continue to do in supporting closer US-Taiwan relations and drawing attention to the critical situation in the Taiwan Strait. Our gratitude also goes to the International Stability Operations Association for co-hosting this virtual conference. American support for Taiwan is rock solid, which is becoming the new key phrase in describing the Taiwan-US partnership. This support is also very much bipartisan. The US administration recognizes Taiwan as a critical economic and security partner and a leading democracy. This is reflected through its actions, including inviting Taiwan to the Summit for Democracy, regularizing arms sales to Taiwan, and joining other countries to underscore the importance of maintaining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. The US Congress has been a steadfast partner to Taiwan, as evidenced by supportive language again in the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act and many other bills put forward in terms of enhancing Taiwan's international space. However, increasing aggression by revisionist powers is destabilizing and dangerous. In particular, the Chinese Communist Party has begun implementing a hybrid strategy that is undermining the peace and stability of the Indo-Pacific region. Taiwan stands on the front line and faces China's daily threats in multiple ways. Last year, we saw nearly 1,000 incursions from the PLA military aircraft into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, an all-time high. In 2022 alone, and as of this week, China has already sent more than 160 fighter jets and aircrafts into our ADIZ. Along with military harassment and cyber attacks, hawkish Chinese officials regularly threaten the use of force for so-called reunification and coerce other nations who disagree with their behavior. China is also wielding its malign influence to obstruct Taiwan from meaningful participation in international organizations based on an intentional misuse of UN General Assembly Resolution 2758. Facing critical challenges from China, we don't seek provocation. Neither will we bow to pressure. Taiwan will continue to bolster national defense, especially our asymmetric capabilities, and we will at the same time strengthen our reserve forces for homeland defense. We appreciate the regularized arms sales process, including the recent announcement by the US government to support the maintenance of Taiwan's Patriot missile defense system. To diversify Taiwan's foreign trade and strengthen our economic resilience, we have demonstrated our commitment to deepening trade with the United States, with difficult policies to open our markets, hoping to pave the way for a bilateral trade agreement with the US and open the opportunities to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, otherwise known as the CPTPP. Taiwan will also continue to make substantive and impactful contributions on issues of global concerns, such as climate, disinformation, and public health. Taiwan is not the only one facing challenges from China nowadays. China has increasingly undertaken coercive methods against others around the world as well, notably towards Australia and Lithuania. It's important that like-minded democracies work together to develop tools to counter economic coercion, for there is no other way but collective action to counter China's manipulation of economic leverage to divide and conquer in advancing its political agenda. Taiwan will continue to stand firm to protect the free and democratic society that we have built for ourselves. However, since the scope of the threat China poses is truly global in nature, it has never been more important for democratic countries to stand together to defend the values that we share. I believe today's discussion will contribute to these efforts, and I thank you for your time and look forward to today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Hsiao. Thank you for being with us today and kicking off this amazing event. My name is Jennifer Hong. I am the Senior Director for Project 2049. I have the distinct honor to moderate a panel with 4 amazing panelists today who will break it down, a closer look at the threat to Taiwan, its defense strategy, and operational readiness. As an overview of the panel, I would like to start with Ian Easton, our Senior Director at Project 2049. He is the author of The Chinese Invasion Threat, Taiwan's Defense and American Strategy in Asia. He is featured and quoted regularly on Taiwan and the Chinese PLA on Reuters, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, you name it. You probably heard from him on one of those articles. Ian will start us off by setting the stage for us, annihilation versus coercion in a very broad terms as it relates to Taiwan, and then he will discuss specific Chinese invasion threats against Taiwan. Then we'll go to Eric Lee, our Associate Director of Programs at Project 2049. He's a proud graduate of UCLA and a co-author of the Taiwan's Overall Defense Concept Explained feature on The Diplomat, which he co-authored the piece with the retired Chief of General Staff of Taiwan's Armed Forces, Admiral Li Shimin. Eric will take it on from Ian and focus on the current status of Taiwan's defense strategy, including the overall defense concept, as well as the US-Taiwan defense relations. Then we will go to Mark Stokes, Executive Director for Project 2049. He is the co-founder of Project 2049 with a 20-year veteran of the US Air Force. He retired as Lieutenant Colonel, one of the final cohorts of the Berlin Occupation Medal recipient. And I heard that Berlin Wall fell down soon after he was assigned to West Berlin to monitor the Soviet Air Force. So causation, correlation, I don't know. But Mark will then take on the discussion to attempt to answer the question. Given the threats laid by Ian, and then the current status of our defense strategy as presented by Eric, is Taiwan ready? What is Taiwan's readiness level? So he'll talk about Taiwan's readiness. And then we'll go to Major General Steven Shapiro, Vice President of Logistics at Vectrus Corporation, with a 35-year career in the Army as a logistician. I practiced that word. I don't know if I still got that word right, with multiple tours in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Balkans, and spent the last 10 years with the Army at the theater strategic level in the Pentagon. Now, General Shapiro will wrap up the conversation and talk about the crucial role the US government, allies, and partners play in Taiwan's readiness. Once the remarks are done with the panelists, I'm going to open it back to the panelists for quick response or comments, for a dialogue on the topics that are discussed by other panelists, and then we'll go to your questions. As you can see, we have a packed 1 hour for you, so let's get started. Ian, set the stage for us and take us through the threats.
Hey guys, good afternoon. And to Jen, thank you so much for the very kind introduction. And indeed to all my friends and colleagues at the Project 2049 Institute and also at ISOA, thank you so much for the opportunity to join this discussion and this panel here today. I thought I would kick it off with just 4 quick points. The first point is this, that when we talk about a military scenario in the Taiwan Strait area, whether it is a coercive scenario, so something like a blockade or a bombardment, air missile campaign, or whether it's something even more extreme, such as an annihilative scenario or an all-out invasion and occupation attempt on the part of the Chinese Communist Party directed against Taiwan, it is very, very difficult to suspend disbelief. In other words, when we talk about these types of future scenarios, they often seem very abstract and very theoretical. And I think this is true, and it becomes increasingly true the closer you get to Taiwan and the more you know about Taiwan, actually the more safe you feel. And why is that? I think it's because obviously Taiwan is a very peaceful democratic country. It's a country that has enjoyed an extraordinarily lucky run. Since 1958, Taiwan has not been attacked by any of its neighbors, and indeed Taiwan is not engaged in any sort of use of force from 1958 until today. Taiwan is surrounded by other peaceful democratic countries, so Japan, South Korea, the Philippines. And the environment that has been created over really the past 75 years has been so peaceful, so prosperous, that it's very difficult to think about that changing in the future. And we've come to a point now where we really think of state-on-state conflict as something that is very much out of date and very obsolete or very nearly obsolete, and certainly in a region like this. So that makes it very difficult to think through these scenarios and to suspend disbelief. What also makes it difficult is that according to most studies, Taiwan has the safest society in the world. That I think is Taiwan and Japan ranked #1 in terms of having the lowest numbers of violent crime cases in the planet. And so when you live in Taiwan, when you travel there, you feel extraordinarily safe. My second point, though, is this, that sense of security is likely to be falsified by events in the coming years. That when you look at the Chinese Communist Party's behavior, not just its rhetoric, which has been very violent and militant, especially under Xi Jinping and some of his recent speeches and at military parades, but also in terms of the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party, its willingness to use violence against its own people, and increasingly to use intimidation tactics and violence against China's neighbors. And of course, we've seen this at the China-India border. We've seen this in Hong Kong, and we are now seeing increasingly aggressive behavior in the East China Sea against Japan, in the South China Sea against all of China's neighbors in Southeast Asia, and especially around and against Taiwan. This also all comes at a time when China is committing genocide against the Uyghur people of Xinjiang. So this is a genocidal regime. So the idea that they could use violence against their neighbors is certainly something that we should take very seriously and should not just be a matter of theory or abstraction, especially also because China has engaged in the largest and not only largest, but also lengthiest, most sustained military buildup that the world has seen from any regime, any country since the 1930s, when Nazi Germany built up. And by many measures, they've already surpassed that in terms of the size and the scope of their military buildup. And so when you fast forward to what the world could look like if the current trends continue, what the world could look like just a few years ahead, that's a very dark picture indeed. And this is the reason now, I think, why a number of American generals and admirals are starting to debate potential timelines for a major crisis, if not a war in the Taiwan Strait area. The third point I would like to make is that in many ways, the coercive scenario has already begun, that we are now looking at the early chapters of what is likely to be a much longer story of coercion in the Taiwan Strait. This is primarily political and military in nature. Now, we tend to focus on the military aspects. Ambassador Hsiao highlighted some of the very troubling military behavior of the Chinese Communist Party directed against Taiwan. But there's also, of course, very much a political element at play, that the Chinese Communist Party has already begun a long-term campaign to try to undermine, weaken, and ultimately destroy Taiwan's democratic government. And, you know, whatever your term of art may be, whether it's political warfare, hybrid warfare, gray zone operations, or my personal favorite, just a war of nerves, this is already something that's begun, and it is continually intensifying over time to the point where we could, in the years ahead, actually come into a future that we very much want to avoid. The fourth point is this, and that is there is good news. And in fact, there ought to be a lot of good news. There's so much more that the United States can do. There are a lot of instruments of statecraft that are available to our government, to policymakers in Washington, for creating an environment that will be much more conducive to the continuation of strategic stability, or to the correction of the picture right now is one where strategic stability is very much coming unglued, but the correction of that and the maintenance of peace and prosperity in the Taiwan Strait area. There's so much more that our government can do. And so the question becomes, when will we start to see that? When might we see that? When might our president start to talk to the president of Taiwan, for example? When might we come to a future where when our Secretary of State or our Secretary of Defense visits other like-minded democracies around the region, they also are able to stop by Taiwan? When might we see ship visits? When might we see cabinet level officers visit Taiwan on a regular basis? When might we see bilateral military exercises occur the way they used to prior to 1979? When might we have U.S. troops in Taiwan to serve as a strategic trip line the way they did prior to 1979? When might we start to see U.S. destroyers continually transiting and patrolling the Taiwan Strait area in order to prevent the leaders in Beijing from making any strategic mistakes or miscalculations? In other words, when might the U.S. government start to correct some of the assumptions that were made when our Taiwan policy changed as it did in 1979? Now, many of the fundamental assumptions that were made by policymakers at that time made good sense at the time, but they have been falsified by events. That what they assumed the future would look like, that future never came. And so now we're in a very different situation. And so I would argue we need to reform our Taiwan policy, and we need to think of that in a very urgent fashion, that there are so many things that the United States is able to do, should be able to do to create a better environment, but currently we're not doing. And so I would argue that when we look to the future, and when we talk about these issues in Washington, D.C., we should avoid over-militarizing this problem and trying to solve it with some kind of a heavily militarized solution where we just focus mostly on arms sales and military training and broaden the scope so that it encompasses potential political, diplomatic solutions as well. And so I think it should no longer be a question of if the United States will one day reestablish diplomatic relations with Taiwan, but rather when we might do that and how we might go about that so that we do get the strategic outcomes that we want and avoid those scenarios that we don't want to ever see come to life. And so with that, let me turn it back on over to the moderator, and I look very forward to the discussion to come. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Just feel like early chapters of discoursive scenarios for long-term campaign. It just seems really daunting. And I think that's why we turn it over to Eric to talk about Taiwan's defense strategy. Where are we? ODC, U.S.-Taiwan relations. Take it away, Eric.
All right. Thank you, Jen. And thank you to ISOA, the Project 2049 team for putting this together, and everyone else who's joining us. And thanks to Ian for setting the stage for what Taiwan's threat picture looks like. It's important to discuss coercion and also annihilation. That's a little bit what I'll be discussing here. Taiwan's defense and its strategy, they both have a rich history, but for the scope of this discussion, I'll focus on recent developments. Over the past few years, Taiwan has sought to adopt a defense strategy that emphasizes asymmetric warfare. The first iteration of this posture was reflected in the overall defense concept, also known as the ODC, which was introduced in 2017. At its core, the ODC outlined that Taiwan faces two categories of threats from the CCP: coercion and invasion. Coercion is already happening across multiple domains, as Ambassador Hsiao and Ian highlighted. Am I coming through okay?
Yeah, Eric, I think you are echoing a little bit, so our audience is having a hard time hearing. It might be your speakers, I'm not sure. Maybe we could do a sound check again. Can you speak again?
How am I now?
Much better.
This is better? Okay.
Yeah, much better. Let's take it from the top again.
Okay. All right. Well, apologies for that. We'll just jump straight into Taiwan's defense strategy. Over the past few years, Taiwan has sought to adopt a defense strategy that emphasizes asymmetric warfare. The first iteration of this posture was reflected in the overall defense concept, also known as the ODC, which was introduced in 2017. At its core, the ODC outlined that Taiwan faces two categories of threats from the CCP: coercion and invasion. Coercion is already happening across multiple domains, as Ambassador Hsiao and Ian highlighted. But it's invasion that poses the existential threat. Thus, the ODC was designed and primarily focuses on the invasion scenario, because invading and occupying Taiwan would most completely achieve the CCP's goals of unifying Taiwan. And because Taiwan is currently, I believe, less prepared against invasion than it is against coercion. On top of that, Taiwan has limited resources and limited time. So the ODC aimed to most effectively use limited resources to build up capabilities in the fastest time possible. The ODC sought to integrate force buildup directly with this concept of operations. It stipulated that large, expensive weapon systems are effective during peacetime against coercion, but that asymmetric systems are most critical during war. The ODC defined asymmetric weapons as mobile, resilient, lethal, cost-effective, numerous, and survivable. That definition is important because asymmetric could mean different things to different countries or different people. And that is what the ODC defines asymmetric is to Taiwan. The ODC also outlines a PLA attack that would have first waves of missile strikes that would lead to an all-out amphibious invasion, regardless of whatever amount of punishment Taiwan is able to incur with interdiction and other means. Asymmetric weapons would be resilient against initial waves of missile strikes and maintain the capacity to strike back. The most vulnerable point for the PLA would be in transit, thus joint fire strikes would be focused in the littoral and landing beaches, as this would be a natural progression of a PLA amphibious invasion. The ODC also aimed to reform the reserve force and separate its form and function from the military, creating a territorial defense force that would be equipped with light weapons and equipment, trained to conduct local operations and anti-airborne missions in a decentralized command and a communications denied environment. This is the basic framework of the ODC. It was designed to be a, clearly outlined logical foundation, which, given resource and time constraints, prioritizes the procurement of asymmetric weapon systems to strengthen the military's resilience and reform the reserve structure. However, it is unclear if Taiwan is continuing the ODC. MND has maintained the ODC as still policy, officially through their spokesperson, yet no one in Taiwan or the US is convinced that the ODC still exists, officially at least. The 2021 Taiwan National Defense Report outlines, the most recent defense posturing publicly that Taiwan has. It divides the military strategy for Taiwan into 4 different stages should the PLA invade. First, denial operations, which would counter embarkation of the PLA, striking operations at sea, attacking operations at disembarkation, and total annihilation operations at the landing phase. For force buildup, the focus for Taiwan would be on long-range strike, air superiority, sea control, homeland defense, information, electronic, and cyber warfare, and joint C2 ISR. These areas of force development are all important. However, it is not clear what Taiwan is prioritizing currently given time and resource constraints. And it's still unclear what reserve reform will look like. Taiwan essentially has its own strategic ambiguity when it comes to defense. And I believe that this is the core issue driving a wedge between the United States and Taiwan. While bilateral relations are probably the best it's ever been diplomatically and economically, bilateral defense relations appear to be worsening. Symptoms include growing voices in the US to coerce Taiwan into buying certain systems and attempts to legislate what weapons Taiwan can and cannot buy. It appears that US-Taiwan defense relations have worsened since Taiwan moved away from the ODC, and that's an under-discussed part of it, because the ODC served as a communication mechanism between the US and Taiwan. It was a clear way forward that both sides understood for Taiwan that was accepted and viewed favorably for the most part by both sides. It wasn't perfect, but it was a platform that could be expanded. The ODC advocated also for a US-Taiwan joint working group that would provide more jointness in terms of planning strategy, more visibility into Taiwan's current status with its operations and training, and also to begin building foundations for a possible ad hoc coalition, for which there are none today. So while arms sales are important, I think it's crucial for Taiwan to have a clearly outlined defense strategy that both sides understand. At this time, I have not met a single person that can clearly explain what Taiwan's current defense strategy is after the ODC. I think that's a problem, whether or not MND believes that they have a clear strategy or they still have the ODC. The effects are not that way. Whether it is to reintroduce the ODC or replace it with a new concept that is also clear and accepted, time cannot be wasted on this debate. By having an ODC or ODC 2.0, this could improve bilateral defense relations and open up more capacity to tackle challenges related to other threats on the spectrum posed by the CCP, especially coercion. With a clear and logical path forward for Taiwan's force buildup, there will be more capacity for more discussions and more solutions for the political dimensions of the China challenge. Thank you. I'll turn it back to you, Jen.
Thanks, Eric. That's alarming that that we all don't understand Taiwan's current defense strategy, and that there. So I think, Mark, I don't know how you're going to answer the readiness question, because if we're still at this stage of not quite understanding the defense strategy. So over to you, Mark. Talk about Taiwan's readiness, given the lack of a space of lack of strategy right now, or at least the way we understand it.
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay. I'll do my best to address these issues. But first, I'd like to say or express appreciation, Jen and ISOA and our participants and fellow panelists for this great great event. What I thought I would do, Jen, to be able to address some of these things is divide up my remarks into 3 different sort of areas. And then I'll bring it back to readiness, but start with just a brief comment about sort of build upon what Ian and Eric said about coercion and annihilation. So just maybe draw an even more distinct difference between the 2 sort of courses of action or families of courses of action, and then talk about some structural issues in U.S.-Taiwan defense relations, and then narrow it down to what I think are priorities that include, but not limited to, enhancing not just Taiwan's readiness, but also the United States' readiness to respond with sufficient alacrity and enough oomph to be able to make a difference in a particular PLA campaign. So with that, starting briefly with coercion, we've heard that reference as well as annihilation. The main difference between the 2, I mean, the 2 are similar in some ways, but the root of this really goes back. Jen, you mentioned Berlin in the old days. Now, I'm going to have certain biases, primarily having to do with the Air Force or air power or aerospace power in particular. But with the Soviet in West Berlin and in the good old days, this would have been, let's say, between 86 and 89, but even preceding that, the Soviets, groups of Soviet forces in Germany that were around Berlin, and of course in East Berlin, we were in West Berlin. There was a conscious effort to use air power of those assets that were based in East Germany, but to use the air power not just for a possibility of an invasion coming through the Fulda Gap that we've sort of heard that term used before, but also for a purpose of coercion. And the main difference between coercion and annihilation has to do with the end state in mind. In annihilation, which includes invasion, or it can include invasion, so can coercion, but in annihilation, you take political goals or political objectives, outcomes off the table. Your sole goal is to go in and to basically annihilate a population and impose your will upon that vanquished population. Whereas coercion has a goal in mind, so a political outcome in mind. It can be a very minor political outcome, or it can be a major political outcome. And sometimes a threat of invasion is necessary before coercion can become effective. There are plenty of examples in history that examines Chinese Communist Party or People's Liberation Army, PLA coercion, and more specifics, all ranging from the artillery shelling of Jinmen in the late 1950s, and actually continuing on for a while. It includes the 1995-1996 missile exercises, which also included an air component. They include the 1999 Cross-Strait flights, the initial flights that went over right and just basically nipped the Davis line. This would have been starting in, let's say, August of 1999, all the way to the types of activities that we're seeing now, increasingly flight activity around Taiwan. There are 2 ways to interpret this flight activity. One is a precursor to some kind of a real military action, often interpreted when the so-called Davison window, in terms of some kind of use of force against Taiwan in the next 6 years. Sure, but that's often been interpreted as an invasion. But in general, the Soviet invasion of East Germany never happened. Their goal in a lot of the air activity, particularly along the air corridors linking Berlin with the West, the 3 air corridors. So part of their goal actually was gradually to constrict Berlin's, well, actually the West, or specifically West Germany, United States, and others, gradually, because we were the occupation force in Berlin at the time, different sectors. But to be able to gradually choke off that airspace, to gradually, and in order to, but gradually and not suddenly, they could have shot planes out of the sky. They could have restricted air flights without much of a problem. But the idea is to gradually, it's like a frog in a boiling pot of water, to gradually heat it up to where you don't necessarily draw a strong reaction. But annihilation is totally different. You just go in and there's a history behind this coercion annihilation. In the old days, when the U.S. first started to gin up their military planning for a Taiwan scenario and to begin to take it seriously about 20 years ago, there was a debate over whether or not to adopt a coercive sorts of scenario or annihilation. Warfighters in general have a difficult time with coercion simply because it involves political considerations. In Marxist-Leninist systems, remembered like Soviet Union or like Communist Party of China, you can't separate. They're much more Clausewitzian in nature in terms of linking a military action with a political goal than we are. So you have to plan for annihilation and invasion from U.S. perspective, but making that the core of your strategy, particularly at the policy level, is somewhat questionable because we just don't know what Beijing's end state is. It may be to physically occupy Taiwan, first island chain and things, but we just don't know at this point. And if you overemphasize on one without focusing on the other, you can be talking past each other, which is the next issue on structural issues. There's, as Eric alluded to, my perception is that there certainly are areas where the two sides, U.S. and Taiwan, are talking past each other, without doubt. And this goes way back. You can read declassified reports out of Pacific Command, for example, dating back to the 50s and 60s and 70s. There's always some area in which the U.S. is expressing, and it's not necessarily unique to Taiwan either, but areas where U.S. is saying you're either spending too much money on defense, or you have too many people in your military you need to reduce, or just a whole range of, you're having problems in reserve force. There's all kinds of problems that are listed in these histories. So what we're seeing today with some of these areas of talking past each other aren't necessarily new. What is fairly new, though, is just what appears to be taking the annihilative scenario and making it now policy to the point where the Davison window is interpreted as invasion. What you're telling people in Taiwan, you got 6 years until some sort of cataclysmic event is going to happen. That doesn't render much in terms of developing popular sentiment or sort of a positive attitude or thinking that there's a future. But when you adopt things in a little bit of coercion, then you understand that there's a political goal. It's easier to think in terms of annihilation because you take politics off the table. You don't have to even think about what's the core source of this problem, but we should be doing that. We don't recognize Taiwan as or the ROC in particular, Taiwan or the ROC as an independent sovereign state. Of course, the objective reality is that Taiwan, under its current ROC constitution, does exist as an independent sovereign state today. We just don't recognize as such, but understanding this difference is important. But because we don't have normal diplomatic relations, normal, stable, constructive relations with Taiwan, we tend to do things or not do things with Taiwan that we do with other defense establishments around the world. One of the basic examples is a fundamental military principle of unity of effort. With other governments and defense establishments around the world, we have unity of efforts that are negotiated and then communicated to publics on both sides. Normally, these are in the form of a joint statement. In the case of the PRC, it was a joint communique. But a joint statement, that's the most effective way of communicating unity of effort. Right now, apparently, political considerations prohibit us from doing a negotiated joint statement, even if it's signed by the unofficial white glove of AIT or CCNA on the Taiwan side. But so this is a key problem. There's no senior level dialogue on a scale of what we have, for example, with Japan with a 2+2. In part, we have senior level visitors that come to the U.S., but it doesn't happen all that often. And whatever reasons we use for having a 2+2 or with other countries, other governments around the world, the justifications for those would apply equally to Taiwan, if not even more so. And then finally, I think Eric mentioned the word asymmetric. There's other problems about how we define these terms in terms of what exactly does it mean asymmetric. When you go back and look at the history of where that term came about in the context of Taiwan, in the modern context, it goes way back to Mao Zedong and all those. It's pretty clear that there's not asymmetric seems to have been uniquely defined for Taiwan. A conspiracy theorist would take it to the point where you just wonder if that initial term asymmetric, calling upon Taiwan to adopt innovative and asymmetric means to its defense, isn't sometimes code word that could discourage Taiwan from procuring or seeking to acquire capabilities that we think maybe they should not acquire. Maybe the United States thinks they're destabilizing. I don't agree with that viewpoint, but submarines are a classic example. In an invasion scenario, an annihilation scenario, certain capabilities like a submarines or maybe even Air Force. In a pure annihilation scenario, these big ticket items may not make a lot of sense. In a coercion scenario, they make all the sense in the world. Coercion and counter-coercion. So a lot depends upon that. And on the defense strategy issue, it's worth noting that Taiwan, again, is unique because it doesn't have a national security strategy. Almost every other defense establishment and defense strategies are guided by a national security strategy to be able to link what your defense strategy is to overall national security goals. Taiwan doesn't have a national security strategy because of problems primarily because of disagreements and national identity disagreements within Taiwan itself. But there are other structural issues that I'll get to later, in particular having to do with related to FMS, not directly FMS, but is the sustainment of systems that the United States does supply to Taiwan through foreign military sales. And sustainment of these systems and readiness on those systems are critical. So finally, looking at priorities, sort of sum up is number one, I would say unity of effort, and that comes to the form of a senior level negotiated joint statement. It can be signed through unofficial auspices of AIT or their counterpart on the Taiwan side. But let's say that's number one. Number two, when you look at again, we've gotten to a habit now of judging what we think Taiwan needs for their own defense, and without ever defining what defense is. What's the goal? Defense against what? We're talking about defense against invasion and annihilation. Beijing could use a nuke, for example, 20 kilometers above Taiwan, and it could pretty much paralyze everything. So I would argue one of the most important priorities for the US side, at least, is to focus on early warning capabilities for Taiwan, as well as command and control to include the United States' ability to seamlessly, ability to operate with counterparts on Taiwan, at least at the strategic level, command and control, if not at the tactical level. You can do a latent interoperability sort of arrangement, for example, on link 16 and data links and having a common tactile picture, or you can all kinds of other things, but needs to be thought about. And finally, again, the United States, Taiwan is one of the largest recipients in the world of U.S. weapon systems, particularly through foreign military sales. Bearing in mind, from Taiwan's perspective, the most visible manifestation of U.S. position on Taiwan's basically sovereignty is an FMS system, because if they were a province of the PRC, we wouldn't be selling weapons to them. We would be selling arms. But every FMS, so it's going to have a higher political posture than we do with other countries. But on FMS, whenever we sell systems, it just the policy level shouldn't stop is when you conclude a letter of offer and acceptance and express notification. It's all moving. It's very important, like we do with other governments around the world, is that we make international armaments cooperation or supply chain security, in this case defined as the spare parts, for example, of existing U.S. weapon systems that we're selling, to make sure to do as much as we can, if possible, to indigenize, keeping in mind U.S. tech transfer considerations and export controls, but to the maximum extent possible, indigenizing Taiwan's ability to, for example, on spare parts, or at least their ability to quickly acquire the needed spare parts when they have to send them back for repair. To me, this is a critical question and a critical issue. And related to readiness, because readiness, when it comes to logistics and availability of their existing weapon systems, a lot of the problems go back to supply chain. And it's an issue that really warrants a lot more consideration. So readiness should be a number one and number one reason why we would do things like supply chain security, defense industrial cooperation, but it's more than that. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Jen. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. I think that segues really nicely into General Shapiro's remarks about, I know that there's some mentioning of FMS, Defense Industrial Cooperation. So go ahead, General.
Jen, so thank you for that. I want to thank ISOA, of course, for allowing me to speak today on Project 2049 for the same. I think I'm going to touch a little bit on what Mark talked about and maybe a little bit about what Ian talked about in some of my remarks. And so I'm going to talk in terms of setting the conditions. You know, as Jen said, a 30 plus year career in the Army as a logistician at the end of my career at the strategic level, at the theater level also, mostly in Europe, but now working a lot of Indo-PACOM. And in the Army, there was a paradigm in the Army. It's always task, condition, standard. And when we grew up in the Army, it was, you know, you've got to get your tasks done, and here's the standard to meet your task. But as a young soldier and as a young officer, I never really thought about the conditions. But in the latter part of my career, it all became about setting the conditions for success. It really is, how do we do that? And I think Mark and Ian touched on that. And I'd like to address some of their comments as I've taken notes and wrap this in. And there's really three things I want to talk about as far as setting the conditions. The first thing I want to talk about is allies and partners. And I think as an American soldier and as Americans, when people hear allies and partners, they tend to think of NATO and think of our allies. And I think at the latter half of my career, as much as I enjoy our allies, working with our allied partners, it really became about allies. It became about the partners. And really, for me, the partners were our commercial industry. Became one of the strategic centers of gravity for me in the latter part of my career. You know, when President Biden went to Europe, one of his first trips, the fact that he went straight to the EU and didn't go to NATO, I thought, you know, because of course, we're not in the EU as America, I thought that's a great partnership message for him to send to the Europeans. Mark talked about readiness in FMS. Well, the FMS sales tend to be country to country, but there's a third party in there. That's the Lockheed Martins, that's the Raytheons, it's those who manufacture. We talked about Patriot earlier in the comments. How do we maintain the Patriot systems on Taiwan? And does it have to be a function of military to military? Because when we talk about supply chain, it's really a commercial supply chain that DoD participates in. If you think about it, just using the Army supply chain or the Air Force supply chain, I think you really limit yourself. And so when I think about allies and partners, I really think at the strategic level, it's time for grown-ups who think about sustaining these forces and think about theater level logistics to think about our partners. Those are the partners that are going to ship cargo from point A to point B. We tend to focus, when we focus on, I think everybody spoke about annihilation or coercion, and we tend to go right to the combat phase of any operation. And I think if we start thinking left of that combat phase, everything we've got to do today to set those conditions, we would consider our partners. The second thing I want to talk about real quick is training as you fight. I think if we were to restart exercises in Indo-PACOM with Taiwan, it would be very important for us to, I think at the small unit level, maybe they'll run a range or do a joint exercise, but it's so important for us to train as we fight as nations. And it goes back to getting our partners involved and getting our alliances involved and making sure that if we have an exercise or if we do something with a partner in the region, we involve, again, I go back to commercial industry. Who's setting up a base camp? Who's doing the deliveries? Who's running our aircraft? Who's bringing things from point A to point B? And I think if we train as we fight, we will realize that it is truly our commercial partners who create some of this bedrock, some of the foundational things, some of the conditions that we need to be successful in the theater. And the last thing I'll talk about is options. And this really comes back, so working with our partners and allies, training as we fight, really comes back to options for the National Command Authority and for the, if you would, the Indo-PACOM commander. It's interesting when you watch what's going on in Europe right now, and I know we're not talking about that, but as President Biden has said, hey, we're going to do this with the 82nd Airborne Division. We're going to do that with aircraft. I assume that when he was talking to the SACEUR about that the SACEUR had a myriad of options that he could give to the president and say, Mr. President, from a military perspective, here's the different things you can do, and it comes in gradients. We've got to set the conditions in the Indo-PACOM theater so that if somebody calls the Indo-PACOM commander and says, hey, we think something's going to go on here, Indo-PACOM commander, what are my options? He's got to have more than one, sir, deploy the force. That can't be the only option. And so how do we look at these options? I read a lot of articles preparing for today. And I think one of the great initiatives that I've seen is the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. It's about a $5 billion wedge in the US budget. And I think they're still working out precisely what's in there, but how do we spend this PDI money in the Pacific theater? Do we buy end items? Do we buy airplanes? So when the Indo-PACOM commander says deploy the force, a larger force goes over? Or do we, let's invest in missile defense of Guam. Let's invest in base camps in the Philippines. Let's invest in, if you would, intermediate staging bases that would help get us from here to there, where we can do things like refuel, where we can store ammunition. And so I think a great initiative and a great way to create options for the National Command Authority would be the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. But I would submit to the group here, the biggest threat then, if setting the conditions is a thing that we're going to do, and Ian, I think you spoke about, what is it we want to do? And I would offer those as options. The biggest threat to doing those options becomes our internal fighting inside of the U.S. Government and how to pass a budget. We are still operating today. We are talking today about deterrence, about potential combat operations. We're talking about all these things, and we don't have a federal budget. And so everything that we do, every initiative that we take is off budget. And I think that's a fairly, for somebody who's worked in the Pentagon and worked theater level logistics, not having a budget is a pretty big deal right now. So the biggest initiative that we've got is this PDI. And I think we can use that to set conditions for options. And the biggest threat to that, I think today, outside of annihilation, of course, is our inability to pass a budget that's agreed upon that sets conditions for future operations. I know I probably kept it as short as I knew how to, Jen. Again, you did pronounce legislation correctly, and I appreciate that. And I do again appreciate ISOA and Project 2049 for allowing me to speak today. Thank you.
Thank you, General Shapiro. My practice did pay off, so that makes me very happy to hear. So right now we have about 18 minutes, and I know we have questions, and I want to give our panelists an opportunity to respond. A quick response. Go off mute, and then let me know if you want to speak. Wow, everyone just agreed with each other. Oh no, go ahead, Ian.
No, I completely agree. I'm looking forward to the questions from the audience.
Okay. Eric, Mark, go ahead, Eric.
Another quick comment. First of all, Ian, Mark, Steve, just great comments. Just wanted to fire off first with what Mark mentioned about, asymmetry. It does have asymmetric weapons do have different definitions for different countries. However, I think it's a new development that in Taiwan, they have, from the ODC, defined asymmetric weapons as mobile, resilient, lethal, cost-effective, numerous, survivable. I think the government has taken out the cost-effective side to it, but for the most part, the spirit is still there in terms of kind of maximum impact with minimal effort, attacking vulnerabilities. But I understand that in any sense, all type of warfare, all weapons seek to be asymmetric. But in terms of definitions, that is what it is. With the ODC, though, another comment is the balance of asymmetric and other platforms, right? It's not just all in on asymmetric. It's meant to be a balance of both because the threat of both exists. So I think that's important to highlight. And I would also submit, just based on what Steve mentioned with the PDI, possibly an option with less budgetary constraints with pre-positioning stocks with the war reserve stocks for allies in Taiwan, putting spare parts, munitions in Taiwan, that would be from US inventory that, if necessary, could be transferred to Taiwan through an FMS program. But yeah, those are my comments. Back to you, Jen.
General Shapiro, did you want to respond to that?
I would agree with Eric. I've got an extensive background in Army pre-position stocks in Europe, in POMCUS, and working with our Israeli allies and Korean allies on the WISRA, if you would, the War Reserve stocks for our allies. And I think having pre-position stocks is a way to spend PDI that is it gives a level of enduring readiness. I think sometimes we spend a budget dollar in America, and the next day that dollar's gone, and the effect of that dollar is gone. But anything we can do to increase readiness, I think Mark, you hit on readiness several times, whether it's the Patriot readiness or air fleet readiness, or War Reserve stocks for our allies in forward locations, break glass in time of war, I think is a great way to spend a dollar. It gives you that lasting readiness that we always seek. It gives you it's not just about the cost of the dollar, it's the value of the dollar in this conversation. I think it's a very valuable proposition that you would offer.
Okay. All right, Mark.
Yeah, Jen, should I also address some of the questions we have in writing in addition to responding to General Shapiro, Eric, and Ian? I would. There's a few questions that have come in regarding Ukraine. Just if I can address that just very quickly. On the biggest difference, and I think the first thing, almost have to repeat it as a mantra every day, and that's that Taiwan, under its existing ROC constitution, exists as an independent sovereign state, but it's not recognized as such. And that's the biggest difference between Taiwan and other defense establishments around the world, including Ukraine or Japan or Philippines or whoever, is that Taiwan's they don't have a national security strategy, but the biggest difference really between Taiwan and Ukraine is that Taiwan, it operates in a totally different, Ukraine is a recognized state. In fact, bear in mind that in the UN, I believe we had a seat both for the Soviet Union and Ukraine, even though nobody seemed to have a problem with that one. But very quickly on issues like ODC, on this one, it's fine it's a concept, and Eric can correct me for all, it's a concept, but there hasn't been much of an alternative developed. But when the US side, in my opinion, when the US side internalizes that concept of overall defense concept and actually then makes judgments based on what we believe to be the ODC, where you have like ODC compliant weapon, systems that Taiwan's asking for in US selling, that's where it gets kind of dangerous. Taiwan's not stupid when they want to procure submarines or other systems. They have their reasons. It would just mean we shouldn't confuse our inability to understand why with their allegations of that they don't know what they're doing. It's just there's going to be big differences. And then finally, on the issues like WRSA or supply chain security or defense industrial cooperation for Steve, do you have much experience in dealing with other major like international armaments cooperation partners like Japan, what we have going on with them, or perhaps South Korea or India or Australia or other defense establishments in which we have a senior level oversight over the whole ecosystem with regard to supply chain and things like that?
A little, mostly in Europe. My experience, of course, Mark, is mostly in Europe, and we're dealing with people who've had our weapon systems. Growing up in NATO, they grew up in NATO also, and so they're using the newest version of tank, but they've also had the older version. So I think it's a much more mature process when dealing with our allies who we've known for years. The FMS that you tend to see, that I tend to look at now, I don't want to say it's episodic, but these are relationships that are not as deep and as enduring as we've had with our allies, and hence we've got to really kick that up.
I'm going to now move into our questions, starting with Russell Hsiao from Global Taiwan Institute. In what specific ways would a more normalized relationship between the United States and Taiwan enhance deterrence and contribute to a more effective defense of Taiwan? And I kind of want to combine that with Perry Campbell's question from Precision Machinery Research and Development Center from Taiwan. He did talk about nuclear weapons. If nuclear weapons, it would make the cost of national reunification would be incalculable for China. So as we're answering that first question, kind of tying in nuclear weapon, is that even an option for the relationship. So I know Ian, Mark, Mark, you're smiling. Ian, you went off mute, so I'm gonna go to you first.
Okay, thanks, Jen, and thanks, Russ, for the great question. I think General Shapiro mentioned something very important that deserves to be further emphasized, is when scenarios happen, the President of the United States gets on the phone with our commanders in the region. The problem that we have when it comes to Taiwan is our commanders out at Indo-PACOM, as a matter of policy, are not allowed to visit Taiwan. They don't go there. They don't exercise with their Taiwanese counterparts. They don't know their Taiwanese counterparts. And that's very problematic if you are a general or an admiral and your job is to prepare for war and you don't even know what the terrain looks like, whether that's physical terrain, the geography, or the human terrain, because you are not allowed by policymakers to actually go to that country. In my mind, that is a recipe for disaster, that there is no way the President of the United States is going to get good military advice in the middle of a crisis from men and women in positions of great responsibility who are not even allowed to visit the potential battlefield. I think that's a very problematic situation that we're in. Russ, to your other question and to the question about nuclear weapons, look, I mean, the Chinese Communist Party is engaged in a very troubling nuclear buildup. And that is not only about Taiwan, but that is certainly probably mostly about Taiwan, because most of their military buildup is directed at Taiwan and by way of extension, the United States and our allies. And so we need to be thinking about that. We need to be thinking about nuclear deterrence, again, in the way that we did during the Cold War when we took it very, very seriously. We need to think about escalation control. And this is why it's so important to think about coercion. What do you do in a crisis? What do you do when you're being coerced and your adversary is continually ratcheting up the pressure and they actually have dominance at both the conventional level of conflict and also at the nuclear level of conflict? How do you deal with that? And so I think this is why it's so important that we begin the process, and it may be a long process, to normalize diplomatic relations with Taiwan, because if we don't move down that path, we're going to walk into a future where the President of the United States has very few good options available to him. We're also walking into a future where the people of Taiwan and the government of Taiwan can be out-escalated, and there'll be very little we can do about it. And I think that would be the ultimate tragedy, because again, the United States has so many instruments of statecraft available to us. Things like we're doing currently to help Ukraine, where you have phone calls, you have visits from foreign leaders, you have shuttle diplomacy, you have all these things go on. Unfortunately, none of that is going on today with Taiwan. And so I think this is why we need to start reforming our Taiwan policy so that we can have a better defense and security posture.
Mark, did you want to add anything?
Sure, just a couple quick points. First, I believe there's a question on how moving toward a more normal constructive relationship with the ROC, Republic of China or Taiwan, would enhance deterrence. I think that was one question. The other one was, would Taiwan continuing with its past nuclear program, would that enhance deterrence? On both of these, on the first one, I tend to view, in my view, deterrence is like oxygen. You don't really think about it every day, but it's, of course, you got to focus on deterrence. Deterrence, of course, is basically manipulating the cost-benefit calculus of the regime in Beijing so that they would come to the conclusion that they would not use force to be able to attain their goal. But the concept of moving toward a more normal constructive relationship with Taiwan is more just simply what the biggest source of instability actually is the US's and Beijing's unwillingness or inability to be able to balance legitimacy on both sides. It's just, you'll hear talk of strategic clarity or strategic ambiguity. In a pure military sense, real strategic clarity would be where the United States at least acknowledges Taiwan for its legitimacy. You don't have to necessarily go to take a position on sovereignty, but there's a difference between legitimacy and sovereignty. But deterrence is such a limiting concept. So would normalization enhance deterrence? It depends on how you define deter what. What exactly? Are you talking about an invasion? I don't know. I don't know if that's a knowable question, but would it deter Beijing's political coercion against Taiwan? Of course it would. That's the obvious solution, is that you want to gradually adopt a Woody Hayes approach. 3 hours in a cloud of dust with Taiwan, but have a clear goal where you want to go, not because you want to, at a spite of a Communist Party or Beijing, but simply because it's subjective reality. It exists. You can't trap 23 million people. You can't shut them out of the international world. U.S. has a role to play. So on the nuclear weapon thing, again, maybe a contradictory, but nuclear weapons seem so 20th century-ish, or they just seems, real, I would say real men, but that would be, but strike with precision, conventional precision, minimal casualties, whatever you can, economy of force, that's the real thing. And I would also add, it's not necessarily a nuclear weapon, but it's the effect. If you're looking at major effects, be able to impose costs upon a potential adversary, you can approach things similar to a nuclear capability, but let's say by having a concerted way of using the old Air Corps tactical school approach, which is where you analyze where if we're going down this Taiwan, we're going to take as much of the Chinese economy down with us. That'd be a fascinating study to figure out how much they could do that. There's blockades using submarines against Shanghai and other major ports of entry. So there's a lot of other things other than nuclear weapons.
Okay. We have 3 minutes and we have just various different questions about Ukraine right now. So, Taiwan's government is watching and increasing military combat readiness for them. Beijing is watching to see what the US government is going to be doing. Russia's watching, Ukraine's watching, the whole world is watching. I just want to open up as last remarks for you. What is the threat level to Taiwan today, given Ukraine? One of the questions was, should US give up on Ukraine just for a grand Asia strategy? So just want to open it up to your comments as Ukraine as it relates to Taiwan today. And we can start with whoever goes off mute first. All right, General Shapiro, take it away.
I will, again, as a logistician who spent a lot of time in Europe, I think you can't walk away from Ukraine. I think that sends a very bad message. I think when people look at our recent policy in the Middle East for the last couple of years, we've made some mistakes. I think people, other countries watch. What I will say is this, though, I go back to one of my opening comments. There's a way for us to engage in Ukraine without being physically committed. I do think that when the EU says we want to take a leadership role, with those of us who wear the NATO brand see the EU as a threat. And I would say that's the exact wrong attitude to take. I think the EU amplifies our power there. And if the French and the Germans and the British, and I know not the Brits, but the French and the Germans and the Italians, maybe with the British, if they, even though they're not in the EU, they want to get together and they want to take the lead on a policy in Europe and let them lead it. I think we can husband our forces, husband our resources, and support that effort while still maintaining our goal towards a desired end state in Indo-PACOM. I think fully committing to forces there, I think is problematic, but propping up the EU to do that for the free world, I think is a great thing for us. And we ought to see the EU as a complementary asset to NATO versus an adversarial.
All right. I think this concludes our panel. Thank you, General Shapiro. Thank you, the Project 2049 team. And I am going to hand it over to Colby Ferland for the next panel. Thank you all.
All right. Hello, everyone. My sound coming through okay? We're good. Just made the switch here with Jen in the conference room, command center. But all right, awesome. Yeah, thanks. Go ahead. All right. Well, I'm Colby Ferland. I'm our Director of Programs at Project 2049. I'll be serving as our moderator for panel number 2. So after that great discussion we just had, where we really kind of broke down, a narrow, like a focus, like a beeline right on Taiwan, looking at some of the specific issues, the threat, the strategy, the readiness. And so now what we'd like to do is kind of build that out a little bit. So once we did the deep dive on Taiwan specifically, now we'd like to move to panel 2, which we call Building It Up. So this is going to be about the United Nations, Taiwan's international space, and the role of US and allies. For this panel, I'm honored to be joined by Mike Mazza, who's a non-resident fellow at American Enterprise Institute, as well as by Gary Schmidt, who's a senior fellow at American Enterprise Institute. We also have Shihoko Goto, as acting director of the Asia program at the Wilson Center. Then Leland Lazarus, a special assistant and speechwriter to US Southern Command. And then also by Jeff Grieco, who's president of the Afghan American Chamber of Commerce, and he's also an ISOA board member emeritus. So that's who we have on the panel. I think we'll do introductions right before each panelist speaks, so I don't do the full bio for everyone, and then we get lost as the audience. But on this topic of building it out, I'd like to begin with the topic of the United Nations. And so for that, we're going to have Mike Mazza and Gary Schmidt come on, and they've put a presentation or a verbal presentation for us. So a little bit of background here. So Mike Mazza, like I said, non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, also at the Global Taiwan Institute, also at the German Marshall Fund. He analyzes US defense policy in the Asia Pacific region. It looks into Chinese military modernization, cross-strait relations, Korean Peninsula security, US interests in Southeast Asia. Mike writes regularly for Global Taiwan Brief, which is GTI's bi-weekly publication. And he has contributed to numerous AEI studies on American grand strategy in Asia. So in Asia, in the Asia Pacific, and also Taiwan specifically. His published work includes pieces in the Wall Street Journal, LA Times, Foreign Policy, and other prestigious outlets like Project 2049 Institute as well. And when introducing Mike, I'll also give a little bit further background on Gary Schmidt. So Gary's also a senior fellow in the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies program at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies issues related to the American presidency, US Constitution and principles, American civic life. And Dr. Schmidt also writes on national security topics. A former minority staff director of the US Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Dr. Schmidt was executive director of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, which was then known as the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. And before joining AEI, he was executive director of the Project for the New American Century. So Dr. Schmidt, like Mike Mazza, is the author, co-author, editor, and co-editor of many books and publications. And one of them that I'd like to highlight before I kick it over to them is one that we had the privilege of putting out on our website called Righting a Wrong, Taiwan, the United Nations, and United States Policy. So in that publication, which is available on our website, Mike and Gary make the case that for several years now, the United Nations has misread the resolution as meaning that Taiwan is a province of the People's Republic of China. Neither the resolution nor the UN Charter empowers the UN Secretary General to make this determination, but to the contrary, as Mike Mazza and Gary Schmidt demonstrate in that report, which also, by the way, marks the 50th anniversary of Resolution 2758, Taiwan's participation in the UN system would be in accord with international law and the interests of a globalized world. And they say, absent greater flexibility from Beijing regarding Taiwan's engagement with the UN, the authors argue that the United States should launch a full court press to achieve Taiwan's formal membership. Just love that powerful blurb. But I'm now going to stop talking and turn it over to the experts who wrote that awesome report. So I think I'll go immediately to Mike Mazza.
All right. Thank you, Colby. And thank you to Project 2049 and ISOA for putting this event on and having us here. So yeah, as Colby said, Gary and I wrote this paper, which Project 2049 Institute published last fall. And sort of the idea behind this was to take a look at UN's engagement with the United Nations and a recognition that what we've been doing for a long time it isn't working. So the United States, like-minded partners, stand up and call for Taiwan's meaningful participation in a variety of different international organizations. China says no, and that's that. So it seems to us it's time for a sort of a new look, a new approach, And in order to sort of lay that out, we start by taking a look back in history. How did we get to where we are today? How did Taiwan end up on the outside of the UN looking in? Were those decisions grounded in international law? So I'm going to talk through some of the history here before I turn it over to Gary, who will talk about the legal and policy rationales for Taiwan's inclusion going forward, and then talk about what a possible new approach might look like. So briefly on the history, the debate over the China seat, the so-called China seat in the UN, essentially became a thing once the Chinese Communist Party won the Civil War in 1949. Right, in 1950, the Soviet Union called for the representatives of the PRC to take that seat, and that debate went on for the next 2 decades. And for most of the 50s and 60s, that debate obviously went Taiwan's way. Taiwan was on strong ground. Votes year after year didn't show much support for a switch in representation at the UN. That slowly began to change over the course of the 1960s as the PRC gained more and more diplomatic partners. But the ROC really rapidly lost ground between 1970 and 1971. And the real reason for that, approximate cause, I think it's fair to say, is Henry Kissinger's secret visit to China, followed by the announcement that Richard Nixon would make a visit in the months to come, which very quickly, put the United States in a position in which it was saying to the rest of the UN General Assembly, do as I say, not as I do. So even as the United States continued to support Taiwan's participation and its membership in the UN, the path had sort of been set when the United States came out and said it was going to be pursuing formal diplomatic ties with China, at some point in the years to come. And so we had in October of 1971, the passing of UN General Assembly Resolution 2758, which replaced, the quote unquote representatives of Chiang Kai-shek with those of the PRC. As many of you know, I'm sure, Resolution 2758 doesn't mention the words Republic of China, doesn't mention the words Taiwan or Taipei, and doesn't actually say anything about sovereignty over the island. And we'll come back to that question shortly. So, was the expulsion of the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek grounded in international law? This is the first big question that Gary and I ask in the paper, and our basic answer is no. And there are a number of ways that it could have been rationalized. First, was the PRC admitted as a new state? And the answer to that is no, and that wasn't the argument at the time. And indeed, the Republic of China was not expelled. Rather, the replacement was made based on the idea that a country, China, had undergone a simple name change. Was it legitimate to replace the ROC's representatives at the UN with the PRCs based on an assessment that the country had undergone that name change? This argument rests on the assumption that the international legal personality of the states in question was preserved. What does that mean? So international legal personality. Entities who are endowed with rights and obligations under public international law are said to have that international legal personality. And as we argue, it's pretty clear that by 1971, both the PRC and the ROC on Taiwan had undeniably distinct international legal personalities. The ROC continued to enjoy all of the rights and obligations that it enjoyed under international law. It enjoyed those rights and obligations up until and indeed beyond its representatives' expulsion from the United Nations. Nothing of substance, for example, changed between the time that the ROC deposited its instruments of ratification for the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1970 and the time that the UNGA passed Resolution 2758 in 1971, right? Nothing of substance changed during that year. Nor did the PRC during that time frame acquire an international legal personality that it had previously lacked. And that then raises another question. So if both the ROC and the PRC had unique international legal personalities in 1971, was the UN's decision that it made via 2758 appropriate as a matter of international law? Surprise, surprise, again, we say, no, it was not. To be sure, there's a case to be made for the PRC's inclusion in the UN and even its inclusion on the Security Council, but it's harder to make the case that the PRC was the successor state to the ROC, that it was the same country, China, but with a new name, given that the Republic of China never ceased to exist and what's more, continued to meet the Montevideo qualifications for statehood. Gary will talk a bit more about that, but very quickly, those qualifications are a distinct territory, a distinct population, a governing authority, and an ability to engage in relations with other states. And so a true reckoning of the state of affairs in 1971 would have recognized the existence of two states, both with a right to UN membership, and both with reasonable claims to the China seat on the Security Council. And thus we see the legal justification for 2758 as fraught. The second thing I wanted to talk about before turning it over to Gary is the UN One China policy, which is often cited in UN decisions to keep Taiwan excluded. So where did the One China policy come from was something that we wanted to investigate when we were writing this paper. And the answer that we come up with is basically that Kofi Annan made it up in 2003. And then Ban Ki-moon went further, claiming that the UN considers Taiwan to be a part of the PRC in accordance with 2758 several years later. And of course, that's nonsense, right? As we've discussed, 2758 doesn't say anything about sovereignty over Taiwan. It doesn't even mention Taiwan. UN agencies have issued similar statements in the years since Ban Ki-moon made that initial statement about what 2758 says. And so now the UN leadership, both in the Secretariat and the Secretary General, but the agencies as well, UN leadership now acts as if the United Nations has made a determination on the status of Taiwan and that it has long maintained a one China policy. But here's the problem. The UN has not actually made such a determination. It cannot make such a determination, and it has never formally adopted a one China policy. Again, just more history very quickly. So first, the United Nations is bound by the Treaty of San Francisco, in which, quote, Japan renounces all right, title, and claim to Formosa and the Pescadores. The treaty did not transfer that title to any other country, right? Which is why the US position is that the question of sovereignty over Taiwan remains undetermined. So secondly, the UN is institutionally incapable of making territorial dispositions. The UN Charter does not give the UN this power, nor does international law recognize a vote within the UN as a legitimate means by which territorial dispositions may be made. Third, even if the UN could make such dispositions, it has taken no steps that can be construed as making a determination on the status of Taiwan. There's never been a vote on such in either the General Assembly or the Security Council. And finally, we argue that UN leaders are wrong to describe the UN as having a one China policy. Again, since 2758, there has never been a vote on how or whether the UN should engage with the Republic of China or on the question of sovereignty over Taiwan. And at this point, I will turn it over to Gary. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm trying to get, there we go. First of all, I want to thank Colby for the introduction, and I also want to thank 2049 and ISOA for hosting us today, Mike and I, and talk about the paper that we did back in the fall. I recommend that you not wait for the Netflix version of it, that you go ahead and download it whenever you can. I need to. There we go. So let me begin. I'm going to talk Mike's done so much of the history, and I'm going to talk pretty briefly, I hope, about both US law and then international law, and then transition from there into a discussion about our proposals for moving forward when it comes to Taiwan's participation in the UN, international organizations of the UN and other bodies, international bodies like that. So let me begin by noting that most of the time, when we think about the Taiwan Relations Act today, we think of it as mandating the US government supplying Taiwan with weapons and military supplies necessary to defend itself as required by the law. Arms sales are what make the news, and with good reason, given the military situation in the Strait today. But I want to point out, but the act also states that the US should have, quote, the capacity to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion that would jeopardize the security or the social or economic system of the people of Taiwan, end quote. In other words, Washington is supposed to care about China's bullying of Taiwan and to have policies and plans in place to mitigate such coercion. But as Hofstra law professor Julian Koo has pointed out in congressional testimony, this non-military form of coercion is exactly what Beijing has practiced in barring Taiwan from participating in various international organizations. And of course, the most telling example being Beijing's use of its de facto veto over Taiwan having observer status to meetings of the World Health Assembly. In the past, when the government in Taipei accepted a one China framework, it was given observer status. But when it didn't, as in recent years, Taiwan has been denied entry to the assembly. Through this form of coercion, China obviously intends to pressure Taiwan, and not so subtly. Taiwan is told, concede on one China and there'll be benefits. Without that concession, there will be a cost. All of this, of course, is part of Beijing's broader effort to isolate Taiwan internationally and in turn send a signal to Taiwan's citizens that the island's future is problematic, if not bleak. But again, under a normal reading of the TRA, the US government has an obligation to push back against such coercion. And if the act's language is taken seriously, do so effectively. And while the TRA was intended to fill the gap in relations between the US and Taiwan after diplomatic ties had been broken, its working premise was that Taiwan still retained a distinct international personality. Otherwise, why the law at all? And all the effort to maintain ties if no longer diplomatic relations in the case of Taiwan and the US. That Taiwan has a distinct international personality, of course, would come as no surprise to the government in Taiwan. As Taiwan's foreign minister, Joseph Wu, has succinctly noted about his nation, quote, we issue visas, we issue passports, we have a military and a currency. Taiwan exists by itself. Taiwan is not party of any other country, end quote. Taiwan, of course, is recognized diplomatically by other states and is a member of such entities as the World Trade Organization and the Asian Development Bank. And as we know now, as we see on the TV, it participates separately in the Olympics. And in fact, as Mike mentioned, under the Montevideo Convention, which the US signed back in the early 1930s, Taiwan meets the four core elements of statehood: distinct and substantial territory, a distinct and substantial population, a governing authority, and an ability to engage in relations with other states. In short, as a state, Taiwan walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and hence is a duck. What is important to note here is that the Montevideo Convention marked a transition from what was then known as the constitutive theory of statehood, an international practice in which a country's statehood depended on formal recognition by another state, most often meaning one of the great powers. The convention was intended to disentangle the issue of statehood from the political machinations of imperial powers vis-a-vis their once colonial possessions who had acquired the attributes of statehood. In short, the goal was to take recognition of statehood out of the hands of London, Washington, Paris, and Berlin. So perversely, the international community is now allowing Beijing to act as though this change in international law practice never happened. Like so much of China's long-term game plan, when it comes to Taiwan's international status, they are trying, and with some success here, to rewrite the rules of the road. So the question is, what should be done? Well, to start with the obvious, Washington should publicly reject, as Mike suggested, the UN's interpretation of Resolution 2758, and more generally be more assertive in making the case that Taiwan's involvement in the UN system and other international organization is in the interest of the global order and global well-being. As everyone here probably on this podcast knows, Taiwan is important in all kinds of areas, strategically, economically, high-tech supply chains. It has been a willing contributor in humanitarian assistance efforts, non-proliferation efforts, and public health. The reality is that the global community is less well off when Taiwan is excluded. It's a point American public diplomacy should make more often than it does currently. As for something more concrete, the US should begin by launching a more serious and targeted campaign focused on gaining Taiwan membership in the WHO, the World Health Organization, or I should say readmittance, since Taiwan was a founding member of the WHO in 1948. The key here is that membership in the WHO does not require UN membership, and moreover, admittance only requires a simple majority vote in the World Health Assembly. Membership in the WHO also has the advantage that it would open the door to Taiwan's participation in other specialized agencies whose charters make allowance for admitting states that already have membership in other UN specialized agencies, whether they have a seat at the UN or not. In short, pushing for WHO membership is a smart opening play. But next, Washington needs to come to terms with the fact that to date, there has been little, if any, progress in securing space for Taiwan within the WHO or other organizations because of China's intransigence. Our argument is that the US needs a more muscular approach to gain more leverage. Absent far greater Chinese flexibility in allowing Taiwan's participation in these various organizations, Washington should be prepared to undertake a full court press for membership for Taiwan in the United Nations. Our view is that Beijing would not welcome this being a topic routinely brought up for consideration. Even if blocked for consideration by Beijing and or Moscow at the Security Council, it would be embarrassing to do so year after year. Putting China on the defensive for a change would be a good thing. It's also useful to remember here that overlapping claims of sovereignty and territory have not precluded membership in the UN. Both South Korea and North Korea were granted membership in the UN in 1991, despite neither recognizing the other and both claiming sovereignty over the whole of the Korean Peninsula. In similar fashion, East and West Germany never had formal diplomatic relations with the other, and both were admitted to the UN as members in 1973. In short, UN membership and diplomatic recognition are not coterminous. Obviously, a push for Taiwan's UN membership by Washington could not be a one-off. It would have to be a multi-year effort, perhaps a decade-long effort. But unlike in the past when the topic has been raised, such an effort today would take advantage of the changing perceptions of both Taiwan and China around the world. Perceptions that could be reinforced by a forceful presentation by Washington and democratic allies in Asia and elsewhere. In some ways, such a push by the US would be taking a page from the PRC's playbook in the 60s and 70s, when it slowly and gradually gained support for its own membership. It's possible, of course, such a push will not succeed, or not succeed as quickly as one might want. But in making the broader argument that Taiwan deserves a seat in the UN, there'll be two benefits regardless. One, it will give a useful public example of just what it means for there to be, in the Biden administration's words, a competition between authoritarianism and democracy. And two, it'll make more difficult for allies to give short shrift to Taiwan's efforts to gain some form of participation in these other international bodies, such as the WHO, even if only as a practical concession that Taiwan deserves at least that support. Let me close by drawing an analogy to baseball. The United States and Taiwan are not winning by playing small ball, looking for walks and singles when it comes to participation in the UN organizations. It's time for Washington and Taipei to think about hitting for the fences. Colby, back to you.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Gary and Mike. I mean, your expertise in this topic is clear. It's a privilege to be able to listen in and to have that publication on our website. So we're proud of it. Everyone out there, it's posted on our website. You can go and read through it thoroughly. Just a reminder, anyone that had questions, maybe specific to what Mike and Gary had to say, you can submit them right now. The earlier, the better. I can start to organize them. But for now, I'd like to continue on to the topic of international space and introduce Shihoko Goto, who's now joining us for the third, I think this is the third one of webinar that we've had the privilege of Shihoko's pleasure. So privilege of Shihoko's attendance. There we go. So thanks so much, Shihoko. A little bit of background for the audience. She's the acting director of the Asia program and deputy director for geoeconomics at the Wilson Center. Her research focuses on economics and politics of Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, as well as U.S. policy in Northeast Asia. She's a seasoned journalist and analyst, reporting from Tokyo and Washington for the Dow Jones and UPI on the global economy, international trade, Asian markets. She's a columnist for the Diplomat magazine and contributing editor to the Globalist. Previously a donor country relations officer for the World Bank and has been awarded fellowships from the East-West Center and the Knight Foundation, among others. Always a pleasure to have Shihoko with us. I believe she'll be talking about Japan's shift in rhetoric regarding Taiwan and talking about Taiwan's bid for CPTPP, which is Comprehensive Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think. Yes. And, Japan-Taiwan relations in general. So it's a privilege to have you back, Shihoko. I'll turn it to you.
Great. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Colby. And thanks to Project 2049 for giving me this opportunity to share the Zoom space with such illustrious speakers. So my marching orders from Colby was to really focus on Japan's role in shaping Taiwan's international foothold. Before I do that, I'd like to reiterate that since the pandemic, and especially over the past year, there's been renewed acknowledgement worldwide that ensuring Taiwan's stability is not just in Taiwan's own interest, but it is in the interest of the world at large, and that the world needs a democratic and prosperous Taiwan just as much as Taiwan needs support to be fully embraced by the international community. And we also know that the world economy would be severely disrupted without Taiwan. Literally, the world cannot run without Taiwanese technology. It is, of course, the biggest producer of the most advanced semiconductors in the world. And at the same time, Taiwan is also vulnerable to disruptions caused not just by political tension, but not natural disasters as well. The US interest and commitment to Taiwan overlap, but not necessarily completely align with those interests expressed by Taiwan's immediate neighbors. The geographic proximity to Taipei and Beijing alone means that the threats posed to Taiwan's security from the PRC is a direct threat to the security and stability of countries across East Asia. And that is particularly the case in Japan. And over the past year, especially, Japan has been incredibly proactive in highlighting the fact that ensuring Taiwan's security and stability is an integral part of Japan's own security strategy. Much, of course, of Washington's debate has centered around when and whether military intervention for Taiwan will happen, and how Washington can deploy its networks of allies and partners, including how and whether support from Japan will be needed. And there's clearly been growing rhetorical support from Japan towards Taiwan. We see that, for instance, from the bilateral US-Japan statement that was released last spring, after the summit between President Biden and Prime Minister Suga, which the two sides agreed and noted the, quote, importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, unquote, and that made headlines on both sides of the Pacific. And it was really the first reference of Taiwan in a bilateral statement between Japan and the United States since 1969. So subsequently, that phrase has been reiterated a number of times in the international sphere from the G7 and beyond. And meanwhile, in Japan, we've seen former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe make a speech last year, which made waves worldwide, declaring that strong support for Taiwan, including armed invasion of Taiwan, would present a serious threat to Japan, which some have seen as a significant shift in Japan's position regarding Taiwan. Japan's current Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, who is the third premier since 2020, he took office last autumn, and he's really had to focus a great deal of political energy on domestic issues. And the Kishida China policy is still very much in the making. Some have argued that it could be less hawkish, but at the same time, Kishida himself has not shied away from stating that a Taiwanese emergency is a Japanese emergency and an emergency situation for the US-Japan alliance itself. And it's clear that it is in Japan's national security interest to prevent the PRC from taking actions in its claims to Taiwan. There is the very real fear within Japan that China's territorial ambitions towards Taiwan will expand also to the Senkaku Islands, which of course was nationalized by Japan about a decade ago. But there's also a fear of backlash from China should Tokyo's support for Taiwan go beyond the current rhetoric. So far, there has really been no direct action taken against Japan for its verbal support of Taipei. The question then becomes, where is China's red line when it comes to allies coming to the defense of Taiwan, either by word or by deed? And Tokyo is well aware that clashes in the East China Sea and the nationalization of the Senkaku Diaoyutai Islands are such red lines for Beijing at the moment, and they have triggered immediate reaction from Beijing. We'd already seen about a decade ago that China had imposed rare earth export restrictions when there were clashes in the East China Sea. And after this nationalization of the Senkaku Islands, there were formal protests and clashes and boycotts of Japanese products as well. But what Japan has done over the last 10 years or so has been to wean itself gradually but steadily from China. It has developed new markets. It is exploring new areas for investments. It's seeking new partners for commercial opportunities. We've seen that strategically as well as the Abe government really embraced and promoted the Free and Open Indo-Pacific initiative, reaching out to Southeast Asia, enhancing relations with the subcontinent and India without provoking an immediate public backlash from Beijing. Since the pandemic, since March 2020 in particular, Taiwan has been a critical partner for Tokyo in achieving some of its key economic objectives, not simply during COVID, but also in imagining a post-COVID world. That world is really about boosting self-sufficiency, bolstering domestic resilience, and partnering with trusted governments as needed. And it is clear to Japan that it definitely needs Taiwan in the all too critical semiconductor sector. And we see that at the end of last year, TSMC was given Taipei's approval to build a $7 billion fab in Japan to produce 22 nanometer chips, which is the most advanced semiconductors to be produced in Japan. That is, of course, a relationship that was fostered between TSMC and Sony, the Japanese manufacturer, but it also symbolizes something much bigger than that, something much bigger than a alliance between two companies across borders. It is a broader seal of trust between Taipei and Tokyo to share critical technology. And we see that the United States, which released its Indo-Pacific strategy late last week, we see that Washington's focus on technology cooperation, even amongst industry competitors, is very much in the interest of national security. And the focus from here on out is really going to be about export security and how to develop economic policies that also bear the needs and priorities of military security as well. For Taiwan, of course, leveraging its semiconductor technology is key to driving its economic growth, but it's also critical as it tries to carve out a position in the international community. It is definitely a powerful card to play in the security realm, but it's also a powerful card to play as it seeks to be part of the CPTPP and any other international network it is eyeing to be part of. And as I said on the outset, the world simply cannot run without Taiwan. Taiwan's bid to join the CPTPP is going to be one of the biggest challenges for Taiwan moving forward as it looks to carve out its international space. And that cannot be possible without Japan's support. Bear in mind that the United States is not part of the CPTPP, neither is India. And Japan is the biggest economy amongst the 11 member nations of the pact. CPTPP is a trade deal first and foremost, but it actually has as much geopolitical significance, if not more, than economic consequences. Taiwan has already taken steps to be accession ready to the CPTPP. The latest move being to lift the ban on imports from Japan's Fukushima prefecture this month, which were first imposed by Taipei in 2011 after the Fukushima nuclear disaster. It of course, has been a politically divisive issue within Taiwan, not unlike the lifting of restrictions on US pork imports, which of course faced a public referendum last year. So what happens next? We can expect Tokyo to demand a quid pro quo from Taiwan, especially within the realm of CPTPP accession. The ban on imports from Fukushima persists in not only the PRC, but also Hong Kong, as well as South Korea. Japan will be looking for Taiwan's support to not ensure that Taiwan's doors are open to Japanese exports from Fukushima, but it will also be seeking support to open those doors to PRC as well as South Korea as well. Bear in mind that both mainland China and South Korea are also looking to join the CPTPP, and they too, together with Britain, have made a formal bid to join the trade treaty. There is going to be further politicization of the food safety issue when it comes to Fukushima. And there will be further politicization of agricultural exports at large. And we will be seeing greater competition when it comes to issues regarding open markets and conditions for accession into the CPTPP. And I think we should be mindful that food safety concerns will continue to be a hot button issue in Taiwan in the run up to the next presidential elections two years from now. The governments across the world, including Tokyo, will be closely monitoring how Taipei deals with the issue, and more broadly, of how Taiwan balances its commitments to international agreements, including trade deals, whilst reflecting and honoring public opinion. So let me leave it at that for now.
Awesome. Well, that was great. Thanks so much, Shihoko. I mean, it's too bad I have to leave it for audience questions because I wrote so many down myself. So we can get back to that later. But thank you so much. For now, for the sake of time, I'd like to just keep rolling right along, talking about international space, and we'll pivot here a little bit and start looking at Latin America and the Caribbean. And for that, our guest is going to be Leland Lazarus, who currently serves as a special assistant and speechwriter to the combatant commander of U.S. Southern Command, who is General Laura Richardson. Leland was also in that position when we did an event with the previous combatant commander, Admiral Fowler. It was on June 1st, I believe, and also on our website for anyone interested. It was Near and Present Danger, Southcom Commander Admiral Fowler on U.S.-China strategic competition in the Western Hemisphere. So we've been building up our what do you call it? Our core competency and our work on the region as well, but no one can speak to it as well as Leland can. And so for that, a little bit more before I go in on Leland. He previously worked as a U.S. Foreign Service officer in China and the Caribbean. Before joining U.S. government, he was associate producer at China Central Television and taught English language as a Fulbright scholar in Panama. And so, as I said, Leland here is kind of an expert where the rubber meets the road. And so I think Leland's going to join us today and give us some insight on what U.S.-Taiwan cooperation looks like in Latin America regarding, expanding its international space. And, in more broadly, among Taiwan's remaining diplomatic allies in the region, what is the state of those alliances? What does it look like? I think Leland's going to give us a little snapshot of that and CCP coercion and U.S. efforts in the region. So for that, I'll turn it to Leland.
Colby, thank you so much for that introduction. And Mike, Gary, Shihoko, Jeffrey, it is really an honor to be on this panel with you. And happy Valentine's Day to everybody. I'm sure that our respective spouses want us to finish this as quickly as possible so we can get to planning our Valentine's Day dinners. Now, when we talk about the China-Taiwan diplomatic feud, I'm surprised that Latin America and the Caribbean doesn't get brought up as often, especially given the fact that of the 14 governments left in the world that still recognize Taiwan, 8 of them are in Latin America and the Caribbean. That's Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, Haiti, Paraguay, St. Lucia, St. Kitts and Nevis, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Now, the region has been in the headlines recently because Nicaragua just made that switch at the end of 2021. And also there was a recent election in Honduras where the then candidate, Xiomara Castro, said that she would consider switching diplomatic relations from Taipei to Beijing if she got elected, but has since walked that back since the election and the inauguration. But I think it shows the fact that for China watchers, for cross-strait relations experts, this region can really be used as a bellwether to take the temperature of China-Taiwan issues. Let me just step back real quick and talk a little bit about PRC's increasing influence throughout the whole region in recent years. Of the 33 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, there are now 21 countries that are signatories of the Belt and Road initiatives. One of them being Argentina, that just last week, the Argentinian president, Alberto Fernandez, visited Beijing for the Beijing Winter Olympics, and then on the sidelines of that, signed the BRI MOU, which included everything from pledges of investment in a nuclear power plant to more investment in lithium carbonate, which is so important for renewable energy and electrical vehicles and everything in between. Of course, the PRC also has a bunch of port projects, over 40 throughout the region, some of them located in strategic choke points like the Panama Canal and the Strait of Magellan down in Argentina, and also 5G technology, safe city, smart city, and everything in between. And of course, the PRC has used its economic might and continues to use its economic might in order to pressure countries in the region to either switch diplomatic relations or to punish countries that are continuing to do business with Taipei. Let me give you 2 recent examples. Paraguay, last year, in the midst of COVID, when Paraguay really needed vaccines, the BBC had reported, and actually the Taiwan Minister of Foreign Affairs had criticized the PRC for dangling sales of vaccines if the Paraguayan government switched diplomatic recognition. And it was basically through a diplomatic effort on the part of India, the United States, and Taiwan to provide Paraguay with 100,000 vaccines just in the nick of time that prevented that from happening. But that pressure will continue. Another example to bring up is Guyana, because last year Guyana had announced that it was going to open up a commercial office of Taipei, which of course got a lot of criticism from the PRC embassy. And again, there were reports that the reason why Guyana walked that back was that the PRC threatened not to sell vaccines to Guyana if Guyana went along with creating that commercial office. So it just goes to show how this region very much is another front line of strategic competition between the US and China, but also of competition between Beijing and Taipei. Now, people ask a lot, what can Taiwan and the US really do to bolster our relationship with the Taiwan recognizers in this region? And I've got two sort of suggestions. Gary, you had mentioned swinging for the fences in our support for Taiwan. And I think that these are small but significant suggestions I think will really get at that. One is the US embassies and the Taiwanese embassies in those Taiwan recognizing countries. They really have to do a better job at strengthening not only the high level diplomatic engagement, but also the working level, tactical level engagement between their diplomats and employees at the embassies. As Colby had mentioned, right before serving at Southern Command now, I was a foreign service officer in Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean, of which the three saints, St. Lucia, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines are part of that jurisdiction. And part of the main focus that I had there was to really build out that person-to-person working level relationship with our Taiwan counterparts in those three countries to make sure that we're amplifying each other's messages, right? That we're supporting each other and really telling that joint story of why it makes more sense to have democratic partners who are supporting you other than authoritarian regimes. An example of that is in the height of COVID, the US was going to be donating 10 ventilators. And we had found out that our Taiwan counterparts that same week were going to donate 4 ventilators. And so I worked hand in hand with my Taiwan counterparts to organize a joint press conference. Our US ambassador, the Taiwan ambassador for St. Kitts and Nevis, both giving speeches and really showing a united front that the US and Taiwan were donating 14 ventilators to the people of St. Kitts and Nevis, right? So it really goes a long way of showing that united front of democratic partners. Another example is St. Lucia. During Global Entrepreneurship Week, we had worked with Taiwan potential investors and US potential investors. We organized a virtual program where they got to speak to local St. Lucian businesses and young entrepreneurs in order to share best practices and really talk about possible areas of investment in renewable energy and tourism that St. Lucia needs so much in its economic development. So the State Department has these regional China officers, which they've actually expanded the number of regional China officers throughout the world, but especially in the Western Hemisphere. Just a couple of years ago, there was just one regional China officer, and she was working out of Lima. And now there are more. There's my good friend who's in Barbados, who basically replaced me. He's in charge of all of the Caribbean. And then there's another one in Panama City and another one in Montevideo. And so I think that those regional China officers can really be used as the points of contact to really create that those on the ground and tactical relations with our Taiwan counterparts in those countries. And lastly, I would say that in addition to bolstering that messaging with Taiwan recognizing countries, we should also encourage more countries in the region and throughout the world who recognize the PRC, that they can continue to have a healthy and balanced relationship with both Beijing and Taipei. In this region alone, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and Peru, they all still have Taipei economic and commercial offices, despite maintaining diplomatic relations with the PRC. Panama is another example. Even though Panama switched diplomatic relations in 2017, still enjoys the free trade agreement with Taipei. So the more that we can do in order to encourage more countries in the region and around the world to have that healthy balance and healthy relationship between Beijing and Taipei, I think would go a really long way. Shihoko, you were talking about how the world needs to run on Taiwan's technology with semiconductors and things like that. And so we should definitely encourage more countries to do so. And I'll stop there.
Well, that was awesome, Leland. It's almost like you're a professional at putting together, speeches and talking points for yourself and people. That was amazing. Highly enjoyed it. And I thought it was great that you brought up the regional China officers as well. We actually just had a meeting with, I think, 3 of them in the region, and our office has the utmost respect for that program. I think it's grown from originally 6 people to now over 24, kind of doing that throughout the world. So it's an excellent initiative by the government, and those people are awesome. So cool bringing that up. Okay, thanks, Leland. I saw some questions come in, but now let's turn first over to, last but not least for the panel, who will be Jeffrey Grieco. And Jeffrey Grieco is the Deputy Chairman of the Society for International Development, the Washington chapter, which is the largest trade association of the international development and humanitarian community. Additionally, he's President and CEO of the Afghan American Chamber of Commerce. And he's, as I said in the beginning, he's also a board member emeritus at ISOA. He's an independent foreign policy consultant with senior leadership experience in the U.S. government and private sector, providing support and advice based on his unique background in the fields of foreign policy, national security, international business development, congressional public affairs, and international assistance. So, as Leland was giving us some background on where the rubber meets the road in Latin America, I think this is going to be where the rubber meets the road from the industry perspective. Mr. Grieco is going to join us today, and speaking on behalf of ISOA, he's going to talk about, I think, 5 specific recommendations on the Taiwan issue, which will represent U.S. defense, stabilization, contingency operations, international development, and the humanitarian community. So really looking forward to it, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Great, thanks, Colby. Really appreciate it. I apologize for my voice, everyone. A little bit hoarse today. I'm representing ISOA's industry interests in this webinar today. I want to make the following actionable recommendations on behalf of our community, but also these ideas and recommendations are my own, and I haven't gone back and cleared every single one of them yet with our board or anyone else for that matter, but I think they're very representative of what I know ISOA's interests would be. Our first recommendation is, because of the increased military, diplomatic, and economic pressures globally by the PRC and the Communist Party of China, I think we agree as an industry group that it's time for the US government to develop an integrated, let me say a better integrated economic, diplomatic, and military strategy for Taiwan relations. This strategy should include a series of new relationship building measures that include the following. First, we recommend the creation of a Taiwan stabilization funding subaccount as part of the U.S. state and foreign ops appropriation process in the FY 2023 budget. This would fund important stabilization and contingency operations programs that would help both the United States and Taiwan. Next, we would recommend that increased U.S. military support for Taiwan should be established more formally within the defense appropriations process, where we can more specifically marry the policy and the strategy paradigms that many of you have talked about today with the actual funding instruments and the military programming, so that we have recommended programming that our members could then provide strategic inputs on in terms of the practical operational applications and speed of importance. Next, we would launch a formal process immediately to ask the U.S. government to normalize the U.S.-Taiwan economic relationship. We would do this by undertaking both a bilateral trade agreement and a bilateral investment agreement. What we have right now is called a TIFA, a Trade and Investment Framework Agreement. These are basically templated U.S. Embassy one-page, two-page documents that aren't real agreements and have no strategic import when it comes to companies or industries that would like to invest or do trade or make investment. We want to see a bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan and a bilateral investment agreement to be prioritized by USTR and other operational bodies in the U.S. government that are responsible for those agreements. And these should also be used especially to protect sensitive and important commercial technologies, defense technologies, military technologies, and for basically increasing the speed with which our industries can bring investment into the United States from Taiwan and from the United States to Taiwan. In addition, we're going to need at some point a formal bilateral tax treaty. It's unbelievable to me that for 50 years we have no bilateral tax agreement, no bilateral trade agreement with one of our largest trading partners and investment partners. It's really unbelievable when you think about it. A bilateral tax treaty allows companies to plan for and to make foreign direct investments and to move their trade operations to different platforms. A tax treaty is also needed. Lastly, I want to understand more of what the current Commerce Secretary Raimondo proposed in Singapore in November of 2021 concerning a new framework that they're proposing for trade deals and an alliance, her words, alliance of democracies to protect the superpower supply chains. I've read everything that Secretary Blinken, who's in Asia, as you know, right now, meeting. He met with the Quad, he's met with the South Koreans, he met with Japan. I'm not sure what she mentioned and proposed in November is what the Secretary is proposing in the Indo-Pacific strategy document that the White House just put out and which she is now doing a lot of promotion about. So we need to clarify these things and bring it into one unified recommendation. Our second major recommendation is we'd like to help advise U.S. government on ways to better align the full instruments of American power and influence in the Pacific. You need to do this by utilizing all of the new and improved funding mechanisms and instruments of American power, including the Development Finance Corporation. The Development Finance Corporation is the old OPIC. They were going to shut down OPIC, except for the urge that they lobbied hard to have it be the buffer against China's aggressive actions throughout the world. We're running into them not only in Asia, they're everywhere. Fomenting problems and obstructing a lot of the US policy. DFC was going down to defeat in the House and Senate until it was made as that the new institution would be a major front to take on China in fragile states, failed states, and in other locations. DFC is nowhere in Taiwan. I can't find any reference to anything with Taiwan from the Development Finance Corporation, even though they've done billions of deals in the last few years with India and other Pacific allies, Asia Pacific allies. We also want to get USAID more involved. I think USAID's entire budget for Taiwan is about $300,000. No, not millions, $300,000. In addition, the G7 met recently and proposed a whole new facility, a new platform that they will use to boost investments into fragile states. I think it's time for our government to sit down and decide, is Taiwan threatened? And if they are they a fragile state, even though we technically don't see them as a state? That to me is a little bit of rhetoric, but if they are considered a fragile state under our government, then there's a whole series of new funding and other types of programming that are available to them. And that has to be discussed. Recommendation 3, we support I think President Biden's Indo-Pacific framework, in terms of the rhetoric that it's proposed, they're focused on 5 key objective areas. They seek a role in advancing free and open Indo-democracy in the Pacific. They want to build connections within and beyond the region. They want to drive regional prosperity. They're seeking to bolster Indo-Pacific security. That's a big issue. And they want to build regional resilience to the transnational threats. It's hard to argue that any of those are bad ideas, but making it happen is where the difficulty lies. We'd like to know more about how are they operationalizing, or how are they planning to operationalize that framework. Recommendation 4, ISOA would support most of the various legislation that's in Congress right now on a bipartisan basis in support of Taiwan. I think all of our speakers have noted that there is strong bipartisan support inside Congress for Taiwan. It's how do we make that support into reality and help to operationalize it in the field, so America's influence is seen as being very detrimental to China's interests in the region, and that we try to bring them into alignment with a common objective. Right now, Senator Rubio seems to have taken on the largest role in defending Taiwan. He has the Taiwan Relations Reinforcement Act of 2021. If you haven't read that legislation, please do. I can't seem to think anything's wrong with it from my view. But Congress is not great at passing authorizing legislation in terms of our foreign assistance. We haven't passed a foreign assistance authorizing bill since the 1980s, if you can believe it. So how do we then provide authorization in our appropriations process? That's how we do it. We put it in the conference report in an appropriations bill. And that's how Congress, and that's why the appropriators have the power that they have in Congress, is that authorizers can't get the votes to pass normal pieces of legislation like Senator Rubio's bill. My proposal would be that we take the language from his bill or other legislative drafts that there's bipartisan support for and put it into the conference report language and try to put the appropriate appropriations program language into the main bill, assuming we can get a budget passed by the Congress. Recommendation 5, and my last recommendation on behalf of industry: how Taiwan is treated by the United States government is watched very carefully. And I come out of a lot of experience right now in Afghanistan. And I can tell you that we have suffered, the United States has suffered tremendous damage in our reputation inside the region as an ally of freedom-loving people. And we have to be careful, in Taiwan's case especially, that South Korea and Japan and all the other partners in which we're seeking to build a new alliance, Indo-Pacific alliance, India, the Quad, they are watching us very, very carefully. Analysts tell me that they expect that President Xi and the PLA will seek to undermine the credibility of our defense guarantees to Japan and South Korea, and they'll try to undermine it to Australia. They're going to try to diminish the Biden administration's willingness to fight and to defend Taiwan strategically. If allies of the United States are attacked and we don't respond defense-wise, other Asian nations will quickly abandon U.S. alliances and will seek appeasement with a communist China in order to protect their people's interests. Analysts are telling us that they expect the islands of Matsu or Kinmen off the Taiwan coast to be the initial PRC targets, and that this offensive military operation could happen very soon. It likely would happen in concert with whatever Russia is likely to do in Ukraine. I think our industry is really concerned about that. We're concerned about it because we have to provide the stabilization and contingency operation support to any U.S. defense or civil effort to help support Taiwan's defense. And we don't see, from the U.S. government's perspective, the urgency of that threat. It's really important, and I really appreciate all the people here today speaking on this issue. It's a very, very important issue, but it doesn't get sometimes the light in Washington that it deserves for the scope of interest and the impact that it potentially could have on our families in the United States economically, their sons or daughters having to go there in some defensive mission. It's time to raise this and elevate the discussion. It's an important discussion. I appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Wow. Thanks, Jeff. That was amazing. I have to say, you know, being the moderator, I am truly humbled by this panel today. It's clear how much I have to learn left in this field. So it's been absolutely amazing to listen to all this. We have 9 minutes left actually before we turn over to our special discussion with Chairman Schriver and Congresswoman Luria. So if you don't mind, I'll kind of get into some questions off the bat, and we'll take them from there. So first, left over from panel one, we had questions come in from Yoichi Kato and Garrett van der Rees, who we know really well at 2049. And if they don't, you know, humor me in being able to modify the question a little bit so it's more relevant to this panel as opposed to the specifics. Yoichi's question had to do with clarity, providing clarity for allies in the case of a crisis scenario, so strategic clarity. And then Garrett came on and he had a question which was talking mostly about, you know, the role for allies, you know, who, you know, aside from the United States, when you're talking about, you know, from the readiness point of view, he wanted like, what's the role of Australia and Japan? So we'll move a little bit away from kind of like the readiness and the technical topic. And I think there's a heart of the question there, which is, you know, the capacity for other countries outside of the United States to kind of take the lead or be a game changer in expanding Taiwan's international space. And to that effect, you know, what you know, would you, to what extent does the United States need to really kind of lead the way on that, or, you know, to be able to put in, to provide the clarity for our allies to take the lead, whether it's, you know, working in, you know, Taiwan or CCP counter coercion in Latin America, or if it's what our defense industrial base is doing abroad, or if it's Japan's operations in the region, just, you know, a question on who has the agency. Maybe it's kind of a broad question that might work if Yoichi and Garrett will forgive my kind of changing around of how they phrased it. And so for that, I mean, would anyone like to take that question? If not, okay, all right, yeah. How about Gary?
I'm not sure I'll be able to fully respond to the breadth of the question, but to make a simple point, unless you make arguments about the value of Taiwan, the character of Taiwan, and the whole international system, the liberal democratic order and the like, then it's very hard to move the ball on the particular policies that you want to, like trade agreements and other things, because you're always battling against some nebulous understanding of China's influence and the like. So you really have to set the ground more largely. You have to sort of make a case for why Taiwan matters as a democracy and how that matters to us strategically. And then your allies and the others have an easier time explaining it to their own publics and policymakers about why they should do X, Y, or Z. So my classic example of this, and I'll shut up after this, you know, the Helsinki Accord, you know, had all kinds of different elements. But once they had signed it, we used it quite creatively to make the issues about human rights inside the Soviet Union much more policy relevant. And, you know, it didn't bring the Soviet Union to an end, but it did help begin to lay the foundation for challenging the Soviet dominance in places like Eastern Europe. So making the argument matters to start.
Oh, great. Thanks so much, Gary. Did anyone have any follow-up for that? If not, we can definitely, where's that come from? Oh, there we go. If not, we can proceed. But any follow-ups on the allies and no? Okay, yeah, we've got 6 minutes left before we turn over. So let's press on. One, I think this one comes in from, and forgive the pronunciations, Gili Adanilo. And this one may be something that Jeff Grieco could weigh in on. He says, in line with the Taiwan situation against China, do you still see opportunities for U.S. industries in government contracting to thrive in the Taiwan market, or will it be more of an Afghan-like situation?
Well, okay, we have to delineate what type of contracting. If it's defense contracting, that has to be done within a classified environment. There's only certain contractors that are able to do that work. If it's US government funded, if it's Taiwan government funded, there has to be agreements signed on both the military aspects with the US that would be involved if we're doing tech transfer or capacity development using certain proprietary technologies. Those all have to be pre-negotiated clearly. If we're talking broader State Department, USAID type of programming in the country, that is much easier to get done quickly and effectively. And we can do that. Industry can do that. And for us, industry includes the nonprofit community too. Many times the nonprofit community can take on, for example, in health security. We're going through the worst pandemic in our history, and it's likely it's still not going to be going away soon. And we have a lot of NGOs that are doing the frontline work in a lot of host countries, both on the training aspects, but also on vaccinations, on delivery and distribution, supply chain analysis and programming. That can be done very effectively by US companies working in partnership with the host countries, maybe a partner on the ground in those host countries as well.
So thanks so much for that. Time for another question. I like this one, came in from Claudia Rosette. Again, apologies if the pronunciation's off. It says, Claudia says, thank you for the great talks. Getting Taiwan back into the WHO would be a great move, but in practice, is it possible? How would you do it? The PRC has taken a great interest in the World Health Organization since nominating Margaret Chan in 2006. She visited in 2017. Tedros clearly maintains close ties and was just at the Olympics. China carries out aggressive lobbying and threatening in Geneva and in the US in reversing its withdrawal last year with no evident conditions, giving up a lot of leverage. So in the nitty gritty on the ground, how could the US successfully support Taiwan's bid for membership? That's Claudia's question. Real easy one. Mike?
Yeah, I can take that. And I mean, Gary talked a bit about this during his remarks. I mean, I think, there's two basic things that need to be done. So first, to Gary's last point, we just need to be making the argument, right, publicly. Sort of need to win the battle here publicly. But also, to a certain extent, we have to play China's game. So China is out there coercing and bribing and horse trading for votes. And if this is a priority for the United States, then then we have to do that as well. If we're not going to be willing to sort of get our hands a little dirty on this, then we cede the advantage to China.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. And then we've got 2 minutes left before I turn it over. So a closeout question, give a quick chance for Leland and Shihoko. One of our questions came in. We had basically says, we've had so many good recommendations come in throughout this event from all the panelists. So if Leland and Shihoko, like something to write home, to foot stomp, kind of your number one takeaway for Taiwan's international space, I mean, what would you put at the top of the list? If we could have maybe 1 minute each, and we'll wrap on that. Oh, and sorry, we could start with, how about Shihoko?
Yeah, so as I said, the Taiwan has the momentum in its favor. Until a few years ago, Taiwan's position was really to ensure that the limelight was on it, right? And now there is recognition that what Taiwan is, the pressure that Taiwan is under from China, be it in the governance space, be it in trying to get a secure foothold in international organizations to ensure that it maintains its diplomatic relations with the ever diminishing number of countries that it has. These are all not just issues for Taiwan, but it is of concern for the world. And it has this ability to leverage that. And so it needs to, following up really on what Mike was saying, what Jeffrey was saying about identifying where those lanes are and having a specific strategy when it comes to trade, when it comes to security, rather than simply talking about Taiwan and its needs. Have that specific plan, especially when it comes to economic engagement.
Thanks, Shihoko. Leland?
Yeah, I just wanted to footstop what Gary was talking about in terms of just simply making the case. Again, what I'm saying is my own opinion does not necessarily reflect that of the US government, but I think we really can do a lot more with regard to upholding and lifting up and highlighting the good that Taiwan does in the countries that it recognizes. You know, the International Cooperation and Development Fund, for example, right? The Taiwan version of the US Fulbright. You know, they do a lot of great technical assistance in the form of health and agriculture. It's not hard for, say, the US Embassy to advertise that or highlight that on social media and speeches and things like that. And then every time that a local government leader, I'm thinking of Ralph Gonzalez, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, when he's advocating on behalf of Taiwan to enter into international organizations, you know, we can also highlight that as well and support those local politicians when they do things like that.
So thanks so much. This has been such a great panel. I'm so thankful. It's been an absolute honor to host you all today, and look forward to staying in touch. Let's do this again sometime. So with that, being aware of the time here, I have the privilege of introducing the Project 2049 chairman, Randy Schriver, who will be participating in a one-on-one discussion with Congresswoman Elaine Luria, who's coming out of Virginia's District Number 2. So Randy is our chairman, also founded Project 2049 along with Mark Stokes in 2008. Randy's a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs. Prior to that, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs. He was a Chief of Staff and Senior Policy Advisor to the Deputy Secretary of State. And among a great many other things, Randy has a long career of service in the United States, stretching all the way back to his time as a naval intelligence officer. So, fun fact, I think Randy's been on more flights to Asia than I've been on in my entire life going anywhere. And I think he's got an actual count to that. But for that, let me stop talking now and turn it over to our fearless leader, Chairman Schriver.
Great. Well, thanks, Colby, for the kind introduction.
One more thing, sincere apologies. I'd just like to note one change that we had from the previous, from the flow of the event going, from the flow of the conference until now. Both Chairman Schriver and Congresswoman Elaine Luria have agreed to be on the record for this, as opposed to Chatham House rules. So sincere apologies. I should have announced that. So thanks. Sorry. Back to you, Randy.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Colby. Appreciate the introduction and appreciate the discussion thus far. Welcome, Congresswoman Luria. It's a real pleasure for us to have you and look forward to your comments and remarks on these important topics. We've followed your recent comments and writings and thoughts you've put forward on these topics. So we look forward to sharing the platform with you to extend the audience to the extent we can for your insights. Colby already mentioned you're joining us as representative of the 2nd District of Virginia. I've looked at your CV and background, and I was trying to find where you took the easy route or the easy path. I don't think I've seen it anywhere. I have a great deal of respect for anybody who survives the Naval Academy, let alone those that go into the Black Shoe Navy and go surface warfare and nuclear power. 20-year career in the Navy. I'm sure that had many deployments involved, and I know your career was mostly on surface combatant ships, and now a member of Congress. So thank you for your career of service in the military, your continuing service as an elected official, and welcome to our virtual platform today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to join you, and I was able to listen into some of the previous speakers, so I think it's been a very enlightening conversation, and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. Well, we want to get down to some issues related to Taiwan, but we may start broader than that, if that's okay. And wanted to start really with assessing the threat environment. You've spoken a good deal about the growing military capabilities of the PLA, what that might mean in terms of our own capabilities as we invest in the future force. How do you assess things right now? PLA naval capabilities, PLA capabilities more broadly, and how we're doing in terms of that as the pacing element, as Secretary Austin has said.
Well, great. So there's many elements to that question. So I'll start out with I think one of the things that's important is that quantity has a quality of its own. And if you look at just raw numbers, I pulled up some numbers, and for folks who are interested in going in depth, and looking at the recent assessments of PLA Navy capabilities and future shipbuilding projections, the Congressional Research Service, Ron O'Rourke, put together, he periodically updates this, but an excellent document. And there's a table in there that I think is really enlightening because it shows the disparities. And so to give an example, looking back about 15 years, so roughly 2007, we had 59 more ships than the Chinese have. And if you look at it today, we have 52 less. So there's a delta of 111 ships during that 15-year time frame. And if we look forward to 2025, the estimate is that the Chinese will have 420, 2030, 460, and those numbers keep growing really at a very fast pace. What I would say is that, we have struggled essentially to build to what we have set as the goal. The goal of being 355 ship Navy. We loiter around, I think, approximately 293 right now. And if we look at the future shipbuilding plans, it hasn't been really clear to me as a member of Congress. Right now, as the vice chair of the Armed Services Committee, and very focused on sea power. There isn't a current 30-year shipbuilding plan for the United States that projects us out and actually gets us on the trajectory even to 355, and certainly not these numbers as high as the Chinese capabilities. What I would say is that our presence is incredibly important in the Pacific, and with the current number of ships that we have, I think we do not meet the threshold, the number of ships, the presence that we need to have continuously within the region. We do have a carrier strike group stationed in Japan. We have an amphibious ready group stationed in Japan, but the ongoing continuous presence to provide a credible deterrent in all areas of the Pacific, and specifically the South China Sea, we need ships to do that. And as a member of Congress and looking each year, the Navy comes to us and requests, this is what we want to buy. These are the ships we want to build. I think we need to look both at those investments for ships for the future and the platforms we build, but we also need to look at maybe the less frequently examined aspect of the maintenance, training, and modernization of the ships that we have. An example I'll give is, last year's budget came over and the Navy essentially wanted to cut 15 ships. And when we listen over the course of the hearings that we have each year, leading up to passing the NDA, the defense bill, every leader, both civilian and uniformed, from the Department of Defense saying, we need to build a bigger Navy. China is our #1 threat, and we need to put more resources into the Navy and shipbuilding, yet to receive a budget that seeks to shrink the size of the Navy. The proposal had us only building one DDG, one destroyer, which anybody watching shipbuilding understands that that's the platform we can build on time and on budget, and has really been sort of the workhorse of the fleet for quite a while now, and wanted to decommission 7 of our cruisers. That'd be over 800 VLS cells, and 4 LCS. And these are platforms we have, and we have them today. And I think that when we're looking, at the time frame, which perhaps we'll get a little bit more into in the discussion, but Admiral Davidson, before he left as the commander of U.S. Indo-PACOM, Admiral Aquilino, came before the Senate Armed Services Committee last year and said there's a high probability that China could act to take Taiwan by force in the next 6 years. Well, that was a year ago, and I think that we have seen requests coming over from the Department of Defense that seek to shrink the size of the Navy in the idea of divest to invest in the future. Well, that investment in the future is a long way out, and I don't think we can afford to reduce our numbers today. I think we need to do everything we can to keep the capabilities we have while also growing those numbers of platforms. And then the last thing I'll touch on is, the place where we truly have our strategic advantages in our submarine fleet. And in the resulting, NDA that we did finally pass this year, we added $25 billion. That was on a bipartisan basis, and I worked with Mike Rogers, the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, so the ranking Republican from Alabama. We were able to add that and add a lot of resources specifically into what is needed with countering the rising threat from China. So we increased added an additional DDG, preserved at least 3 of the cruisers, added additional funds to the Pacific Defense Initiative, and worked to speed up the construction of Virginia-class submarines to 3 a year. So a lot more things in there that we might want to pull out and talk about individually. But I think that we need quantity, we need presence, and we also need to look at the types of platforms. And maybe we can touch on that a little bit more, some of the thoughts on what the Marine Corps is doing and being innovative and other things that maybe we should be buying that are different than we are right now.
Well, I appreciate you raising that. One of my pieces of maybe unfinished business, leftover business as assistant secretary was I felt we moved the policy in the right direction, but it's actually quite easy for the policy side of the house. We changed talking points, who we meet with, where we travel, but to get this giant enterprise, 2.5 million people, $750 billion budget, to move all elements of it and reorient it for the China challenge has been much more of a heavy lift, if you will. And I think particularly where the services are concerned and where the investment is concerned. So just digging into that a little bit more, I think by my count, we have 3 administrations in a row that have said the Pacific is the priority. Obama administration had the so-called pivot or rebalance, the Trump administration, free and open Indo-Pacific. And now the Biden administration, the White House just released the Indo-Pacific strategy on Friday. I won't ask you about that because it's brand new and we're all probably still absorbing it. But one thing that's clear is they've maintained that view that the Pacific is our priority theater and China is the pacing element. From where you sit in Congress, it seems you can grow and surge for that challenge by increasing the top line or by sort of changing the mix of where you're investing. And from where I sit, I think we have a lot of legacy platforms, a lot of things that perhaps aren't the most appropriate capabilities for the China challenge. But it's got to be one or the other. You got to spend more or you got to spend differently. From where you sit, is there going to be pressure for the top line to come down? And if so, how do we get that sort of reorientation of investments to meet this challenge? You've already talked about increasing the size of the Navy, which I'd love to see, but surface combatant ships are not cheap. So from where you sit on the Armed Services Committee, how does that look to you?
Well, as far as the Armed Services Committee and the support for increasing the top line this year, I speak for myself. I thought that we needed to go into this seeing 3 to 5% real growth. That wasn't what came over, but we made it that by adding. And when it got to the full House floor, the defense bill, the NDA, received broad bipartisan support. There are, of course, people, some portion of the Democratic caucus that just wants to cut, no matter what you say the top line is, and then some even larger portion who was not in favor of adding the $25 billion. But when you take it together on a bipartisan basis, the bill passed easily with very strong bipartisan support, noting that this is the investment that we need to make. And I think that, we need to see an equivalent increase in investment for the coming year. And, when you ask about, shipbuilding, divest to invest, do we get rid of old stuff to buy new stuff? I think there's a balance in there that we really need to focus on, and we need to focus on primarily, this is our main threat with regards to China. I've talked a lot about how there isn't truly a strategy that we can fall back on. I feel like, when members of the senior leaders in the Department of Defense come to Congress, they don't come with a very clear strategy. And kind of just to check how maybe this was done in the past when we were very successful in building up our Navy to a 600-ship Navy under Ronald Reagan with Secretary Elaine. I went back and watched some of those hearings in the 1980s, 1986 Maritime Strategy. And, it was very informative because I think the piece that was missing is there was a strategy, and here's the strategy. We need this many ships in the Atlantic, this many in the Mediterranean, the Pacific, that adds up to 15 carrier strike groups. That equals 600 ships total when you put all of the different assets together. And here's why we need it. And here's the risk of not doing it. And so I think that the way the process is working today from my seat in Congress is that there's a top line. It goes over to the Pentagon. The Pentagon divides that up roughly in thirds. And that's another topic. I think that looking at, China as our pacing threat, a preponderance of the resources should really be going to the Navy and the Air Force in order to, purchase the right equipment platforms and have the proper manning and personnel to deal with that. But also, I think that when we look at, the budget comes over, there's a top line. And I feel like the Navy, and we're talking specific about the Navy, would come to Congress and say, well, here's what we're going to ask for. This is the best we can do with what you think we're going to give us. And that leads to things like, for example, only asking for one destroyer. But it needs to be flipped on the other side. I think there needs to be a strategy. That strategy drives the requirements. Once the requirements are identified, that can drive the POM, which can drive the budget. And if we had a clearly articulated strategy, it would be much easier to justify to Congress, this is why we need the things we're asking for. And we've had sporadic submission of 30-year shipbuilding plans. And even when you look at the 30-year shipbuilding plans we've had over the last few years, if years 1 to 5 change drastically every time there's a plan, it really isn't a long range plan that we're building towards. I think the last administration with Battle Force 2045, I mean, I think they had it right on the fact that we needed to grow the Navy. It was unfortunate that that came so late in the administration that there wasn't the possibility to really start acting on that longer range plan for how to grow the Navy.
Oh, thank you. We can hope that now that the White House has an Indo-Pacific strategy, the national defense strategy will follow national military strategy, and our services will start to plan accordingly for the future force. But
yeah,
I think
I would say that the Navy in specific was not, the role of the Navy was not highlighted extensively in that Indo-Pacific strategy, which I think is a fault. Really understanding the great role that the Navy plays in the region. So I obviously it's newly issued, and I need to study it more. But that was my first observation.
Sure, thank you. When you look out across the region, there are challenges for us to have the kind of coverage that we would like to have because of the tyranny of time and distance and space. But we also have allies in the region. I note you're involved with the Philippine caucus, but we have treaty allies, Japan, Korea, Thailand, Australia. Is your assessment the administration is putting a lot of emphasis on partnership building, also in the Indo-Pacific strategy. Can we close the gap somewhat by thinking about coalition fighting and coalition operations to deal with the China challenge? And who do you regard as are really key allies in the region?
Well, I definitely think that our strength in the region is our allies. The fact that we have so many allies and partners within the region. Part of our challenge in the Pacific especially is the fact that many of our relationships with these other navies and other countries' defense forces are bilateral, and we don't necessarily have a lot of experience operating as a broader coalition with these different countries. I think that the development and really leaning in on the Quad is important. If you're looking at India, Australia, Japan, and the United States as partners within the region, I think that the Japanese, both with our bases there, some of our shared platforms and interoperability are very important. I think the Japanese confirmation that they view any sort of aggression on Taiwan as a self-defense issue makes them strongly committed to working with us. I think that the Philippines reassertation of I think it's 1953 Mutual Defense Treaty and their commitment to that is important. I think Australia has really doubled or tripled down, in their commitment to investing and working with the United States and Britain as far as, developing a nuclear-powered submarine fleet. I think frequently overlooked, but very important in the region is the French. People often forget that 93% of France's exclusive economic zone is in the Indo-Pacific, and they have quite a bit of forces there. And we have seen increased deployments of our European and NATO allies throughout the region, because I think they also realize the importance of maintaining, freedom of the seas, free commerce, and a free Indo-Pacific. So anything we can do to continue to leverage our other countries and other partners in the region to work with us. But I think that there is a lot to be done on an infrastructure and framework for interoperability on anything with many of the countries we've mentioned, on anything beyond essentially a bilateral relationship. So, and I know that, the Indo-PACOM commander, Admiral Aquilino, and his staff, they're working, very diligently to operate as frequently and as visibly as we can with all of these allies. I think if you're someone who watches this, you'll note that, a lot of these operations have been done a lot more publicly and visibly in recent years. And recently we had 2 U.S. carrier strike groups along with JMSDF forces within the region. We earlier, it was just last year, had the British carrier, the Queen Elizabeth, and also operating with our ships and our aircraft squadrons on board. So, the increase in those operations is really important. And, I talked earlier not only about the number of ships we buy, but how we operate them. So opportunities for forward basing and basing agreements for us to operate forward within the region are very important. So that's another place I think we can lean in with allies, because as you said, the Chinese have the advantage of being on their home field. And we have the distance. So how we operate our ships, and our ships that operate out of Japan operate on a different rotational schedule. To get really technical, it's called the FDNF, the Forward Deployed Naval Forces, but the ships operating out of the United States operate on an optimized fleet response plan. So sort of a 36-month cycle where they deploy a certain amount of time, but being creative with our ships so that we can operate them on sort of more of that ready responsive method that our ships that are stationed overseas are operating. And we are doing some innovative things with that on the East Coast with some of our ships in order to respond to the Russian submarine threat in the North Atlantic. But you're taking that model, they're calling it Project Greyhound, but taking something similar to that and applying it to the forces in the Pacific, I think would also be an important advantage, because we can get more presence maybe without actually increasing the number of ships if we just change how we operate.
Thanks. I'm glad you mentioned the French. I had a chance as Assistant Secretary to visit New Caledonia and hear from them, their perspective on particularly the South Pacific. And I think we've got a little rebuilding to do after AUKUS, the unfortunate fallout there. But one of the reasons the French are so important is because of the Oceania region and the Pacific Islands. We're looking at the possibility of our COFA agreements, Compact of Free Association agreements with Palau, Marshall Islands, and Federated States of Micronesia expiring, at least the economic assistance portions of the COFA. I'm unclear as to how we're letting this get to the 11th hour when we've been focused on it pretty intensely the last few years. Do you think we're going to get that done? And if we don't, what kind of message does that send to our friends and adversaries alike?
Well, I think maintaining these relationships, renewing these compacts is incredibly important. I had the opportunity recently to meet with the president of Palau and understanding, the pressure that's being put, on the compact states as well as others in the region, by the Chinese to come in and do economic development and, provide them all kinds of incentives and really put them in debt for the infrastructure that, the Chinese are willing to come in and build in the region. They will clearly say, the president of Palau clearly said, we want the United States to be our partner, and we want to renew the compact. So I think it really needs to be ratcheted up in its priority. And the examples for, are really disturbing because, maybe we have in the past promised that we'll help build a new school for an investment of $1 to $2 million. And then if we don't follow through on something, something on the scale of what we're just spending on the defense budget, something that is, relatively a smaller investment, it can have huge dividends for maintaining the relationship, the investment. So all of the things that we need to do to strengthen that relationship with the compact states is incredibly important. And it is becoming increasingly concerning that we're approaching these deadlines, but the negotiations are not, really in full swing right now. So I have prioritized that. Many of my colleagues as well. I'm part of the Problem Solvers Caucus, so a bipartisan caucus. There's about 58 of us, for folks who think things aren't working together in Washington, really on a lot of these issues, they are. And within the Problem Solvers Caucus, we actually just recently started a China working group that is being led by Ed Case from Hawaii and others. Because I think that we really understand these issues, even these issues that fall outside of specifically the Armed Services or the Foreign Affairs Committee, but, all of the other government agencies that interact around the world and with, the compact states and other, countries in the region. It's really important that we keep our presence and our commitment and our relationships there at every level, because the Chinese are looking to come in and get a foothold in many places where we've had very long-standing relationships, diplomatic, economic, and that has allowed us access to key places within the region.
Thank you. Maybe dive a little deeper on Cross-Strait and Taiwan issues for a few moments, if that's okay. You mentioned Admiral Davidson's 6-year window, now down to 5. We know the PLA has been using Taiwan as really the driving force in their modernization efforts for decades. And I know you've commented on some of the congressional efforts. I believe you commented positively on the Taiwan Invasion Prevention Act. Are there more things we can expect from either the Congress or the administration to accelerate our efforts to have stronger deterrence and help Taiwan prepare for all forms of PLA threat, including just coercion, day-to-day coercion? Are there things that you believe need to be done on this front?
Well, definitely. And I think that, one of our key problems right now is that I think that, the Taiwan Relations Act and the strategic ambiguity that it creates, I think that we are past the time of strategic ambiguity. I think it is clearly the time that the United States needs to make a clear commitment. We could call it strategic clarity, that the United States will act to maintain the status quo. And, it has gone back and forth at numerous periods of time. I mean, I think a lot of times people just assume, the United States will or can come to the aid of Taiwan. And if you look at the Taiwan Relations Act, it is not a mutual defense treaty. So there's no, requirement or even ability to do that for the president to react. And I did, write something a few months back about how I think the president's hands are tied. If you look at the War Powers Act, for example, there really is no authority for the president to take action. And where does that leave us? It leaves us in a situation if the Chinese do decide to attempt to take Taiwan by force. I mean, the strait is not very wide, talking 110 miles roughly. And the amount of time that the Chinese could cross the strait by sea and obviously by air, they're doing these incursions in large numbers every day. That's not enough time for the decision to be made for the president to come to Congress. And I think that, we really need to make this commitment that the United States will act in order to defend Taiwan if the Chinese were to attack militarily. And, I gave as an example this Taiwan Invasion Prevention Act, which is, an example of a piece of legislation. I'm not sure if, that is the direction to go specifically, or if it is a change to the Taiwan Relations Act. But I do think that we need to codify that commitment. And that would also give us the ability to react in a timely manner if the situation were to necessitate.
Occasionally, one hears criticism that Taiwan doesn't share the sense of urgency. They're not buying the right things. They're investing in legacy capabilities when they should be more asymmetric, a word I don't particularly care for because it's not a lot of specificity attached to it sometimes. But do you have a feeling of where Taiwan stands and how well they're doing keeping pace with the threat?
Well, I certainly think that the United States should do everything we can to assist Taiwan in acquiring the capabilities that it needs to defend itself. I think that the fact that we don't have a deep mill-to-mill relationship and understanding of, the readiness and operability of their forces or interoperability with the United States or other countries that may be potentially desiring in the future to come to their assistance. I think that deepening and developing that relationship with the Taiwanese is important. And I think that we need to think about what are the most impactful things that Taiwan can have to defend themselves. I mean, what type of offensive mine laying capability, long range anti-surface missiles, those types of things that, really can harden their defense from essentially a cross-strait assault, to slow that down, to give them time and to, prevent China from potentially rapidly invading and overrunning Taiwan's defenses.
And you mentioned the qualities of the Taiwan Strait, 110 nautical miles of water. It's pretty close. And the PLA is, of course, this has been the organizing principle for them in terms of their modernization efforts. But this is also a PLA that hasn't seen combat since 1979, which, oh, by the way, that didn't go all that well with Vietnam. How confident are you in these assessments of 5 years, 6 years? I mean, it seems that there's a lot of sort of known unknowns when you get to trying to really figure out PLA capabilities and whether they can pull something as complex as an amphibious operation of this kind would be.
Mm-hmm. I caught the Rumsfeld quote there, the known unknowns. You know, what I would say is that is a big question with regards to the Chinese capabilities. As we know, they have a number of platforms. We know notionally what those platforms can be used for and essentially the capabilities of the weapon systems. But one thing that we don't know is their ability for command and control. We think that they essentially have a very centralized command structure, and we don't necessarily know how effective that would be in making timely actions or reactions to countering a force. And, you know, that could potentially be one of their key vulnerabilities that we should leverage as a very centralized command structure. So it is true that, you know, they, although they have increased, you know, their out of area deployments to the Indian Ocean and all, you know, different places around the world with, you know, surface groups, with submarines, with, you know, different platforms, you know, operating in a coordinated large scale manner for something like this is not something that we have, you know, observed them doing, nor have they, you know, done. And, you know, but they do conduct exercises on an annual basis. We are aware of, you know, these exercises that they conduct that simulate a large amphibious assault. And, you know, one of the things that is concerning to me is that they could be doing this annual exercise and one year they turn right instead of left, and 110 miles is not a very long distance. And, you know, we are not present with the right capabilities. Taiwan hasn't, you know, invested in the right defenses. And there is essentially little to no warning as we see an invasion force, you know, crossing the strait.
Great, thank you. Maybe one or two more questions from me, if that's okay, Congresswoman, and then we'll, I think we're going to try to go to a Q&A from our audience after that. I skipped one thing I wanted to ask you about, the regional issues. One of the things that I advocated for was the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. Didn't get it complete while I was in office, but was glad to see it passed after. But I would say it's off to a bit of a slow start in terms of the actual resourcing, and in terms of what we know INDOPACOM originally asked for, and then what OSD came and tried to fill the vessel with. Do you think this will be an important initiative going forward? Do you think it will be built out to be more consequential? And what are your thoughts on the PDI?
So I definitely am supportive of the PDI. I think that we were disappointed within the Armed Services Committee when, you know, DoD essentially came back and, you know, they tried to say that, you know, building different platforms and vessels and other things that were not, they were trying to, you know, if we said we're going to make a big investment in this pot of money and call it PDI, they were trying to pull out of that to do other things. And that's not what the intention initially was. When we did do the 25 billion plus up this year to the defense budget, we did make additional investments in the PDI. And I think Admiral Aquilino and Admiral Davidson before him have done a good job in defining, like, this is what we need. This is what the Pacific Defense Initiative is. These are the investments that we need to make. And much like the European Defense Initiative before it, they were things that didn't necessarily fall into particular buckets as far as programs go. But, you know, I think it is, you know, in lack of saying, you know, we don't have a maritime strategy, if we do have a Pacific Defense Initiative, Pacific Defense Strategy, what are these physical investments that we need to make in capabilities, whether that's air defense of Guam or other capabilities that will be important in the region, that they can be quantified in one place and prioritized. I think that's important. So I think that it is something I certainly support, and I believe many of my colleagues in the House, you know, support going forward, you know, into the next NDAA. And, you know, if you indulge me for 2 seconds, I think part of this problem is, you know, the sort of the feedback loop from the combatant commander. And I question whether, you know, we're about 35 years on past Goldwater Nichols now. And, you know, that has led a lot to what I would say is the deficit of any type of strategy. But I also think that there are things that are broken and not as effective as they could be within our acquisitions process. When you have the commander, the combatant commander for that AOR, you know, saying these are my priorities, yet then going in and competing somehow on an equal footing with everything else that's not the number one priority. I think we need to look at that feedback loop from the combatant commander's needs and how they get prioritized through the acquisitions process and elevated within the discussion and how we fund them within the budget.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I've certainly seen a delta between what Indo-Pacific commanders say they need and what the services are generally prepared to equip them with. The other issue we've had historically is we identify the Pacific as the priority theater, and then we get another crisis in the Middle East, or we get something like 9/11, which understandably we had to respond to, but then we were bogged down for 2 decades, and now we're facing a very dangerous situation related to Ukraine. So maybe this is an unfair question, but can we keep focus and prioritization on the Pacific and do the right things we need to do resource-wise as these other events unfold? And if there were to be a crisis, some have suggested the Ukraine is the equivalent of our Middle East problems that always drew us out of the Pacific, or at least placed considerable constraints on what we could do in the Pacific. Are you worried about this with Ukraine, or how do you feel we would do with sort of near simultaneous crises?
Right. So, I mean, I think the simultaneity issue is something that is addressed in the National Defense Strategy, and obviously waiting to see this administration's take on any revision to the National Defense Strategy. But it, basically calls that we can defeat an enemy in one theater and deter in another. I think that we have to prioritize the Pacific, and yes, there are always going to be demands around the world. And I think that, those demands frequently fall disproportionately as well in the Navy because of the nature of naval forces and their ability to maneuver and respond quickly. And, I think that shifting our focus to the Pacific and having the appropriate forces in the Pacific, it does not mean we have no forces elsewhere, but I do think it means we lean in more heavily, on our partners that we do have in other regions of the world. So if you were to say our presence, for example, in the Mediterranean or the Sixth Fleet, European AOR, are we committing adequate assets to the standing naval forces there? And two, now, for example, we have an entire carrier strike group, the Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group, there conducting exercises. And we just recently operated with both the French and Italian carriers as well, doing, a strong show of force and support for our NATO allies. But, as the question been asked, is there a reason that this is going to be a continuous presence there? We got drawn back into pretty recently having a continuous presence in the Gulf after a period of time where we had not had a continuous carrier presence there. And then the question, as far as the Gulf is concerned, is does a continuous carrier presence really deter Iran? And, all of their activities, there were those strikes on the ships off of Fujairah, there were the Saudi oil pipelines, obviously there's all the other nefarious activity that Iran is doing through proxy groups. And is the presence of an aircraft carrier strike group the right scale and the right responsive force that's necessary in that region? I think that we need to, really evaluate how we can have the best deterrent force specifically for the Pacific. And, another study that came out a few years ago that I read, and then I kind of wrote an article, I think it was in SEMSAC not that long ago, about an idea for a new maritime strategy is that you have a deterrent force and a maneuver force, and you train, equip, and operate those forces in a different way. One is responsive, but one is a deterrent presence. And I think that without a strategy, it's hard to say what the strategy is. I mean, we use the global force management process. Combatant commanders request things. They kind of all go into a tank, and it gets divvied out based off of current competing priorities without really a longer range, I think, strategic focus and goal. So I think that I think this goes right back to your question of what is our strategy. So that would probably start by being defined by an updated national defense strategy, and then going from there with regards to national military strategy and, a naval and maritime strategy, and focus on the Pacific as the primary theater.
Great. Thank you so much. I'll invite my colleague Colby back in, who I think has been collecting some questions from our virtual audience, and I'll turn it over to Colby.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks so much. We've about 20 minutes left and a long list, so I think we have time for maybe 3 or 4. So I'll get right to it. The first one comes from a student at Georgetown and the School of Foreign Service at the Asian Studies Center. He asked, noted that Rep. Luria, that Congresswoman Luria, that you are on the House Armed Services Committee, the subcommittee. You're on 2 of the subcommittees. One of them is readiness. So the general question is, how much does Taiwan and like Japan, like the role of like U.S. and allies come into come into, that purview under like, the readiness subcommittee? I mean, how much do you talk about that in like supply chain security externally, or is it mostly US focused?
Well, I think within the readiness subcommittee, if you think about, sort of just use the Navy command structure, you have operational commanders, and then you have what are called type commanders, and they're man, train, and equip. So I think within the readiness subcommittee, the focus is there on the man, train, and equip side, and really the military personnel is some of the manning side, but the training and equipping and making sure that the right resources are there, the right facilities for our forces to conduct the training, the right material, and readiness overall. We have a lot of insight into the readiness levels of our different types of aircraft and those types of things. And then when you ask about supply chain, maybe some of the readiness deficits are caused by particular supply chain or material or maintenance facility issues. So there always is an amount of overlap between the subcommittees, because although on readiness we might talk about surface ship and submarine readiness, we're also definitely talking specifically about the infrastructure specific to shipyards, both public and private, and the workforce. And so although it might seem like a siloed thing, I think that they very much overlap amongst subcommittees. And I think readiness is one of those that's kind of like readiness and military personnel are probably umbrellas that have aspects that fall over all of the other subcommittees. But I think that the primary focus in every subcommittee over the last few years has been really being prepared to confront the increasing threats from China.
Thanks so much, Congresswoman. It's always fun for us to provide opportunities for the college students and master's students out there to engage. So that's great. Our next question, I'll move right along, comes from Rick Weir at Northrop Grumman. He says, if we let the administration limit certain capabilities that would be interoperable with Japan and Taiwan, are we then running against the intent to bring Taiwan closer? So big concern with interoperability there.
Yeah, so I think that this is a common concern that we have with interoperability and the level of interoperability and technology sharing that we have, because we certainly know that the Chinese are the first to be out there looking to take our technology, steal it, replicate it, and maybe even build and try to improve on it. And so even when we do share platforms and technology with other partners, we don't always share all of the capabilities there. But we're just talking about interoperability. I mean, we don't have any experience as a Navy, for example, in operating with Taiwanese forces. And, there are even the most basic levels of interoperability that you have, for example, amongst the NATO fleet using what's called the ATP, the Allied Tactical Publication. What do you do for search and rescue? And what do you do, for some of the more basic missions? So, I mean, there are many, many levels of this. And I would say that we're like at level sort of zero as far as the routine interoperability with those forces. But I think one of our biggest concerns is that security of our proprietary technology, and by providing that to and sharing it with other countries, we risk that being shared and exploited.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Those are great points. I'll go to another question now that I think probably Randy would be able to weigh in on too. I know you've been doing home run derby over here for the last two. So this question comes in from Russell Hsiao, who's at the Global Taiwan Institute. He says, the U.S. will host the biennial Rim of the Pacific maritime exercises later this year. Should and will the United States invite Taiwan to participate in the exercise?
Randy, you want to go?
If you want me to jump in first,
yes, I think the answer is they should, but I actually don't know the current planning for that.
I'm not aware that there's a plan to invite them. It took me 2 years to get the Chinese out of RIMPAC, so I was pretty satisfied when the PLA was disinvited, when Secretary Mattis passed that message. I would like to see them in. I think there's probably incremental steps before our largest scale multilateral exercise in the Pacific, which is RIMPAC. We should be exercising with Taiwan on a bilateral basis. The excellent point that Congresswoman just made is, the most basic foundational communications and understandings that would be required to operate effectively side by side don't exist. Eventually something like RIMPAC should be a possibility. There'd be the added complications of our allies. The Chinese could pressure us to keep Taiwan out, and we could brush that off fairly easily, but they would surely pressure our other RIMPAC partners, and they might not be able to bear it as well. So it would be complicated, but I think it should be something that we keep as a goal and work toward it. But I think the incremental step I'd like to see is bilateral exercises with Taiwan.
Okay, we want to leave it at that. Congresswoman, did you have any follow-up, or we can move to the next one?
I think we can move on. I'm on the same page. And I guess the only other point is that, I mentioned earlier that a lot of our interoperability and relationships, Navy to Navy within the Pacific, are very bilateral. And there are a lot of challenges with that. RIMPAC is a large exercise that brings a lot of nations together. And a lot of the things that are done during RIMPAC are done at a relatively basic level of interoperability. It would not be an exercise where I'd say we are exercising our most high-end capabilities, but we are certainly deepening that understanding and interoperability amongst our fleets in the region, so that they can operate together.
Awesome. All right. I had another great question lined up here. It says, Chip Gregson, former Marine. So General Gregson says, a relatively low cost, high impact way to enhance deterrence and increase our interoperability is the optimization of our command and control capability in the Western Pacific. New fleet headquarters and joint task force command elements would get the organization right, increase interoperability with allies and supporters, and increase our readiness and deterrence. Services will never support this as it is a tax to them. Can we get the PDI to look at this?
So I would say definitely. And I appreciate the question. And I did mean earlier to touch on some of the things that the Marine Corps has been doing and been forward leaning on that I think are important. But I do think that a standing command structure within the region is important. I had envisioned it in essentially standing maritime groups, potentially bringing in these different allies and operating in different geographic areas, but having standing maritime groups. But that could obviously extend beyond that, and with that, permanent coordination and command and control interoperability link, I think that obviously would allow us to operate responsively with our allies if necessary to respond. But, since a couple seconds left, with the Marine Corps and the concept of EABO and the different ideas of how the Marines can be very mobile and effective in using naval strike missiles, and, the idea of building the LAW light amphibious warship to have maneuverability. I think one of the things that we talked a little bit about types of platforms earlier is, the Navy is very good at optimizing and purchasing everything that is a high-end platform. The lowest end platform we essentially have being the DDG, and then we buy a new frigate, but it's essentially a 2/3 size DDG with less VLS cells, and what additional or different capability have we added? So I think that going to the opposite end of the spectrum with looking at what kind of lower end capability, lower cost that we can build in higher number platforms, like the LAW, like what kind of things are we doing for offensive mine laying capability, long range anti-surface missiles, even things that people might not think of, but a lot of these islands are very hard to access. What about seaplanes or small patrol craft that have a high firepower capability with naval strike missile? I mean, we really need to be looking at the full range of capabilities, and I think that we do have very good high-end capabilities, but I think we also need to diversify in what one may call lower end, but things that we can buy for less cost and in higher quantities to complicate the problem in the region. And so I think that the direction the Marine Corps is going is really driving that discussion in a good direction for what some of those investments can be.
Thanks, Congresswoman. You mentioned you had just a few seconds left. I mean, do you have the next meeting lined up? In which case, I'd like to turn it over for closing remarks.
Oh, not at all. I just meant I didn't want to take too much time on any particular question. So no, I'm definitely still free to stay till 3:30, of course.
Okay, no problem. We're on your time, so very grateful for it. Okay, let me proceed. I have a question that came in from, oops, it's right here. Oh yeah, actually from our previous panelist, Jeffrey Grieco. Thought it was a great question. He said, first, Representative Luria, thank you for your military and public service. I'd like to ask about a deep water port in East and South Asia regions around Taiwan. When the US gave up Subic Bay in the Philippines more than 2 decades ago, we gave up our most strategic deep water port in the region near Taiwan. We are building up Guam and our facilities there, but that is not a quick reaction deep water port for Taiwan response. Can we as a nation focus on fixing this problem looking forward, and where might that be?
So my answer is yes. I think this is definitely something that we need to consider, a deep water port and many other locations that we can operate out of from a quick response. I don't necessarily have a particular location in mind. Maybe Randy can jump in if there's areas that you worked on or looked at when you were at OSD as specific alternatives, but I definitely think this needs to be a priority. And, it's also part of the reason we brought up earlier about maintaining these relationships and renewing the compacts with the compact states, because there's a lot of access to airfields, ports, big and small, that are brought to us by locations that are very strategically located. So, Randy, if you have any thoughts on particular locations.
Yeah, I would just add, I don't think there's going to be another Subic, including Subic, where we would have permanently forward deployed forces stationed. I think it's more realistic that we could have consistent access to particular places. We have an election coming up in the Philippines. I think Mr. Duterte has been quite ambivalent about the alliance in relationship with the United States, even though some very positive things happen, like our cooperation in Marawi City and what we've done in the South China Sea. So I think there's a good chance if it's Mr. Marcos, we see something a little more traditional in terms of views of the alliance, and therefore we might have the opportunity to have more access to Subic. I looked a lot at the relationship with Vietnam with an eye towards the future, and there's another base there that we helped develop and build out that we were kicked out of. We were kicked out of both, by the way. The Filipino Senate voted against having us there in 1994 before the Mount Pinatubo's volcanic eruption. And of course, we were kicked out of Cameron Bay by force. But that's another place where if we do the right things in terms of relationship building and diplomacy, we might have access to. That's a very fine port. It would need some updating, but that would be a very good place to operate out of, given where our interests are in the South China Sea area. So there are possibilities for access. I don't think we'll have another Subic-like arrangement anytime, as far as my eyes can see.
That's great, thanks. And to follow up on that, another one that I think that you both may be able to weigh on as a question from Mike Mazza, which came in, and he said, Congresswoman Luria, you've raised some of the problems inherent in strategic ambiguity. As we begin rethinking longstanding policies, do you think it's worth revisiting the One China policy as well? Does it continue to serve U.S. interests as effectively as it did when it was first developed decades ago? So, really softball questions from our previous panels.
I don't know that I'm ready to, specifically comment on the direction I think that needs to go. I mean, I think that in my mind, removing strategic ambiguity and providing strategic clarity is the United States would act to maintain the status quo. So I'm not advocating for something beyond or different than that. Randy, do you have any sort of thoughts on that particular topic?
Well, I would just say the One China framework, our version of it, was developed on the understanding that we had mutual assurances, very much contingent upon China taking a peaceful approach to Taiwan. That was embedded in our original understanding in the communiques and thereafter. So I do think the Chinese haven't really kept up their side. So I think at a minimum, it's not something we need to be as vigorous in highlighting articulating it at the core of our policy, because it is stressed and challenged right now more from the Chinese side than our own. But I agree with you, Congresswoman. The ambiguity issue is one that I would go after first rather than the One China framework.
Awesome. Okay, well, Chairman Schriver and Congresswoman Luria, it's been a pleasure to hear from you today. So I think we have one last question, but in turning that question over, I'd also like to give it back to the gentleman who introduced our conference today. So we'll be closing out with remarks from Howie Lind and John Gastripe, and I'll turn it to Howie first. I think he had a question too. So over to you, Howie.
Thank you, Congressman Luria. It's Congresswoman Luria. It's really great to hear from you. I'm a former Navy guy, no former surface warfare officer, so it warms my heart to hear all this talk about the Navy. But the question I have for you is that so ISOA, we're a stability operations, we're a private sector based organization of over 120 companies, but we were active on the Hill, nonpartisan, just like Project 2049. So I guess what the question is, we'd love to stay in touch with you and your office about all these issues. From the private sector standpoint, I guess, so kind of a generic question for you. How do you see the private sector mostly impacting? And again, before I answer this, we're in the defense development and the diplomatic areas with state, DOD, USAID primarily, and the intelligence communities. So how would you see our interaction best with Congress going forward?
Well, I think it's great to come see people specifically who are on the armed services or foreign affairs committees who are really focused in on these issues day to day. But one of the things I think would be most helpful in, promoting the importance of this issue is to visit with those members of Congress who, may not be thinking every day, about how we need to build the Navy. I mean, my own background and focus on defense, as well as the district that I represent with the largest naval station in the world and 40% of our economy, being, intricately tied in as well. I think about defense all the time. And I think about the threats with China, but I think that, a larger initiative to reach out to those people who this may not be their primary work on the committees they serve on, but finding that overlap in the work that you're doing that is also important in the areas that they are focusing on, because they're, if you think of the whole of government, somebody might be on the agriculture committee, but there's something very important about national defense, maintaining, freedom of the seas and free trade that is essential because of, essentially, preventing the scenario we're here talking about today, and being able to tie those things together so that they too can think when they hear something about China and why we're investing in defense, it also is important to the work that they may focus on primarily. So that would kind of be my suggestion, is to sort of think outside the box beyond the people in armed services, foreign affairs, and appropriations to other people who you can really educate about the importance of these issues.
That's great. No, thank you for that. Really appreciate it of your time and your speaking to us today. Just for me, honestly, I learned a lot today. I did not realize that we had all this lack of interrelationships with Taiwan, militarily, diplomatically. So that's a lot to chew on here. Let me turn over to my colleague John Gastripe for his remarks, and then I'll just close out real quick. So John, please go ahead.
Thanks, Howie. And let me just echo what you just said, which is I learned a lot today. And I want to thank all of our fantastic panelists today for sharing their knowledge and wisdom with us. And I also want to spend a little bit of extra time thanking you, Congresswoman, for your valuable time with us. I know you dispense your time with an eyedropper, and so that you gave us a full hour is pretty remarkable, and we're thankful and we're appreciative of that. For those of you on the call, the 220 of you that are also on the call with us, Howie says his heart was warmed to hear all this Navy talk. My heart was warmed to hear someone who's so steeped in her brief. You know the issues on the committee, and you know the issues in the region. You're fluent on so many of those topics, and that's exciting to hear that a leader like yourself is coming up to Congress and making a difference. So thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. And it's been just a great day. And with that, and then we're going to do the ping pong one more time. I go back to Howie, who is going to give us the final closeout. So
thanks again, Congresswoman Luria, and also to Randy Schriver. Thank you, Randy. You've been a longtime friend and supporter of ISOA, spoken many times at our events, and with John Gastripe. But so Bi-khim Hsiao, the initial keynote speaker today from the the Taiwan representative of the United States, thank you for your efforts in speaking to us, as well as all the panelists. This has been a wonderful seminar and a lot of content, solid content that we are going to move out and take forward. And thank you, Colby from Project 2049 for being the co-organizer here with John and all the rest. So with that, that closes it out. What a great seminar. And thank you all again. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.